Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more Nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The snow fell in silent communion with London that evening, each flake a confidant to the city's whispered secrets. It was the winter of 1895, and frost painted elaborate ferns across window panes throughout Bloomsbury. Nature's delicate artwork illuminated by the amber glow of gas lamps that lined the streets. The gentle hiss of those lamps provided a constant, soothing backdrop to the muffled sounds of carriage wheels pressing into fresh snow. Within the warm sanctuary of 221B Baker Street, a peculiar tension hung in the air, as palpable as the scent of Mrs. Hudson's cinnamon tea steeping in the kitchen. She stood by her own hearth, not in the rooms she let to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson above, but in her private quarters, where the firelight danced across the worn, comfortable furnishings that told the story of a life well lived. Her attention was fixed upon a letter that had arrived with the evening post, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. The handwriting belonged to an old friend, another landlady from Bloomsbury, and something about its urgent slant caused Mrs. Hudson's brow to furrow in concern. Outside, a single set of footprints disturbed the pristine blanket of snow that had settled upon Baker Street, trailing from the direction of the main thoroughfare. They led directly to Mrs. Hudson's door, where now came 3 measured knocks, each one slightly more insistent than the last. "Coming, coming," Mrs. Hudson called, tucking the letter into her apron pocket and adjusting the lace at her collar. A small ritual of composure, before facing whatever trouble had arrived on her doorstep. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in like an uninvited guest, bringing with it a woman bundled in layers of dark wool, her face partially obscured by a snow-dusted scarf. Only her eyes were visible, wide with worry and rimmed with the telltale redness of recent tears. "Martha, my dear," Mrs. Hudson breathed, recognition warming her voice as she ushered her friend inside. "I've just received your letter, not half an hour ago. Come in before you freeze solid on the step." Martha Whittaker unwound her scarf as Mrs. Hudson closed the door against winter's persistent chill. She was a woman of similar age to Mrs. Hudson, though the last few days had etched new lines around her mouth and between her brows, the geography of recent distress mapped across her face. "I hope I'm not intruding," Martha said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of someone who has rehearsed their words, but still fears their reception. "But after writing to you, I found I couldn't simply sit and wait for a reply. Not with matters as they stand." Mrs. Hudson guided her friend to a chair positioned optimally to benefit from the fire's warmth. "You're never an intrusion, Martha. Now let me pour you some tea, and you can tell me what's troubling you so. Your letter mentioned a problem with one of your lodgers?" The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls as Mrs. Hudson prepared a cup of tea with practiced hands. The familiar ritual, warming the cup, measuring the leaves, pouring the water at precisely the right temperature, provided a momentary reprieve from the unease that had entered with her friend. Martha removed her gloves, finger by finger, revealing hands reddened from the cold. "It's Mr. Finch in the third-floor room," she began, accepting the tea with a grateful nod. "He's been with me nearly 8 months now, a quiet gentleman who keeps to himself, pays his rent promptly, never causes a fuss, but—" She paused, sipping the tea as if to gather courage from its warmth. "But," Mrs. Hudson prompted gently, settling into the chair opposite, her own tea cradled between her palms. "He hasn't left his room in a week, Margaret. Not once." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper, as though the very walls might carry her concerns beyond the room. "At first, I thought perhaps he was unwell, so I knocked and offered to bring him soup or to call for a doctor. No response. I've left trays outside his door, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they remain untouched. I've pressed my ear to the door several times throughout the days, hoping to hear movement, a cough, anything to suggest he's still—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Hudson reached across and patted her friend's hand. "Have you a key to his room?" "I do, but I hesitate to use it. What if he's simply gone, left in the night without notice, yet his belongings remain, and the door is locked from within? I can tell when I try my key. It won't turn properly." Martha's fingers tightened around the teacup. "There's something else, Margaret. Something I didn't mention in my letter, because it sounds so peculiar. The door to his room is cold, unnaturally so. When I press my palm against it, it's like touching ice, even though the hallway is adequately heated." Mrs. Hudson's expression shifted subtly, the familiar look of someone who has spent years in proximity to Sherlock Holmes and has consequently developed an appreciation for the unusual. "Well now," she said, setting her tea aside, "that does sound like the sort of puzzle that might interest Mr. Holmes." "Mr. Holmes? The detective?" Martha's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't possibly trouble such an important man with the concerns of a simple landlady." A knowing smile touched Mrs. Hudson's lips. "My dear, Mr. Holmes has an insatiable curiosity for the unusual, and what you've described certainly qualifies. Besides," she added with a gentle certainty, "if your instincts as a landlady tell you something is amiss, then something is most definitely amiss. We develop a sense about these things, do we not?" Martha nodded slowly, relief visibly washing over her features at being understood. "We certainly do. After 30 years of letting rooms, one develops an ear for the rhythm of a house, and right now, mine is playing a most discordant note." "Then it's settled. Finish your tea, and I'll see if Mr. Holmes is receiving visitors." Mrs. Hudson rose, smoothing her apron with a determined gesture. "He and Dr. Watson returned from an errand not an hour ago, and I believe I heard Mr. Holmes's violin briefly, which often signals he's between cases." As Mrs. Hudson ascended the 17 steps to the flat above, steps she had climbed countless times, their creaks and groans as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, she found herself listening more intently than usual. Years of living beneath Sherlock Holmes had attuned her to the subtle indicators of his mood, the pacing that suggested a mind racing toward conclusion, the silence that spoke of deep contemplation, the manic energy of a case in full bloom. Tonight, she heard the gentle, measured notes of Bach. Holmes, playing not to think, but to unwind. A promising sign. She knocked on the door, 3 precise raps that she knew Holmes would recognize as hers. "Come in, Mrs. Hudson," called the detective's voice, confirming her silent assertion. She entered, to find Holmes by the window, violin tucked beneath his chin, bow suspended mid-stroke as he turned to acknowledge her. Dr. Watson sat in his customary armchair, a medical journal open on his lap, and a contented expression on his face, the picture of a quiet evening at home. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen," Mrs. Hudson began, "but I have a friend downstairs who finds herself in a most peculiar situation, one that I believe might pique your interest, Mr. Holmes." Holmes lowered his violin, his keen eyes studying Mrs. Hudson with the same intensity he might apply to a critical clue. "You're concerned, Mrs. Hudson. This is not merely a social call disguised as a consultation." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Indeed not. My friend Martha Whittaker is a landlady in Bloomsbury. She has a lodger who hasn't emerged from his room in a week. The door is locked from within. Meals left outside remain untouched, and most curiously, the door itself is unnaturally cold to the touch." A flicker of interest crossed Holmes's austere features. He placed his violin carefully in its case and strode to the fireplace, reaching for his pipe. "A locked room, no sign of life for a week, and a door cold as ice in a heated house," he mused, tamping tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. "January is a cruel month, Mrs. Hudson, but it does occasionally deliver the gift of an intriguing puzzle. Please, invite your friend up. Dr. Watson and I would be most interested in hearing the details directly." Dr. Watson closed his journal, setting it aside with the ready enthusiasm of a man accustomed to having quiet evenings transformed into adventures. "I'll stoke the fire," he said, already moving toward the hearth. "The poor woman must be chilled to the bone after travelling in this weather." Mrs. Hudson nodded gratefully. "Thank you, gentlemen. I'll bring her up directly, along with a fresh pot of tea." When Martha Whittaker was settled in the visitor's chair before the newly invigorated fire, a steaming cup of tea in hand, Holmes observed her with the quiet intensity that often unsettled those unaccustomed to his methods. He noted her worn but quality gloves, the practical cut of her coat, fashionable 5 years ago but well maintained, and the calluses on her hands visible when she removed her gloves, telling the story of a woman who managed her boarding house largely without help. "Mrs. Whittaker," Holmes began, perching on the edge of his chair, like a hawk ready to take flight, "please tell us everything about this lodger of yours. Leave out no detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Martha glanced at Mrs. Hudson, who nodded encouragingly, before setting her tea aside and folding her hands in her lap. "His name is Edwin Finch. He took the 3rd-floor room last May. A gentleman of about 40, I would say, though it's sometimes difficult to tell with men of a scholarly disposition. He described himself as a researcher, though he never specified in what field. His references were impeccable, 2 from Oxford professors, and 1 from a gentleman with connections to the Royal Society." Holmes raised an eyebrow at this, but made no comment, allowing her to continue uninterrupted. "Mr. Finch keeps regular hours, or did until recently. He would leave the house at 8 each morning and return promptly at 6 in the evening. He took his meals in his room, and I would often hear him working late into the night. The scratch of pen on paper, occasionally muttered words I couldn't make out. Nothing unusual for a man of intellectual pursuits." "And his visitors?" Holmes asked. "Did he receive many?" Martha shook her head. "Hardly any. There was a younger man who called on him perhaps once a month. They would speak in hushed tones in Mr. Finch's room. And in the last few weeks, before his seclusion. A taller gentleman visited twice. I never saw his face clearly, as he kept the collar of his coat turned up and his hat pulled low, but he moved with the confidence of a military man or someone similarly accustomed to authority. "And when precisely did you last see Mr. Finch?" Holmes pressed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Last Tuesday evening, when he returned from his day's work. He seemed agitated, which was unusual for him. He practically ran up the stairs without his customary greeting. Thought perhaps he had received troubling news, but it wasn't my place to pry." Martha's fingers twisted anxiously in her lap. "The next morning, he didn't emerge at his usual time. I noticed his breakfast tray remained untouched outside his door, and so it has continued for a week now." Dr. Watson, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "And you've heard nothing from within the room? No movement, no calls for help?" "Nothing, Dr. Watson. Complete silence. That's partly why I've hesitated to involve the authorities. What if he's simply left? Perhaps departed through the window for some reason, though we are 3 stories up. It would be mortifying to create a scene over nothing." Holmes stood abruptly, pacing the length of the sitting room with coiled energy. "The window theory is unlikely if, as you say, the door is locked from within, and a man doesn't leave his belongings behind without good reason." He stopped, fixing Martha with an intense gaze. "Tell me about the cold door, Mrs. Whittaker. When did you first notice this phenomenon?" Martha considered the question carefully. 3 days ago, I believe. I had pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear some sign of life within. That's when I noticed the unnatural chill. At first, I thought perhaps the window in his room had been left open, but the cold seems concentrated at the door itself. The wood is so cold, it almost burns to touch. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the room. He turned to Watson, a familiar light of excitement in his eyes. "What do you say, Watson? Shall we investigate this curious case of the silent lodger and the frozen door?" Dr. Watson was already reaching for his coat. "A man may be in danger, Holmes. We have no time to lose." Holmes nodded, his movements becoming precise and efficient as he gathered his coat, hat, and the tools of his trade, a small leather case that contained various implements useful in his investigations. "Mrs. Whittaker, we shall accompany you back to your boarding house immediately," Holmes declared. "Mrs. Hudson, do not wait up for us. This investigation may extend well into the night." Mrs. Hudson rose, practical as always. "I'll pack some sandwiches for you then. It won't do to have you working on empty stomachs at this bitter cold." As Martha Whittaker buttoned her coat with trembling fingers, relief and apprehension warred across her features. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I fear what we might find, but not knowing has become unbearable." Holmes paused in his preparations, fixing her with a surprisingly gentle look. "Fear thrives in uncertainty, Mrs. Whittaker. Whatever awaits us in that room, knowledge will be our lantern in the dark. Now come. The game is afoot." The trio departed into the snowy London night, their footsteps leaving temporary signatures in the fresh snow that would soon be erased by the continuing snowfall. Mrs. Hudson watched from the window, the familiar worry settling in her chest, as it always did when Holmes and Watson ventured into the unknown. The snowflakes danced in the glow of the street lamps, a delicate ballet that belied the gravity of the situation, drawing her friend and her lodgers into the heart of another mystery. Within the hour, a cab deposited Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Whittaker outside a handsome Georgian house in Bloomsbury, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkness. The snow continued to fall, draping London in a blanket of hushed white that muffled the usual city sounds, creating an almost otherworldly stillness. As Mrs. Whittaker fumbled with her key at the front door, Holmes observed the house with his characteristic attention to detail. 4 stories of solid brick, well maintained, but showing the subtle signs of age and adaptation to changing times. 6 windows across the front, 2 currently dark, 1 on the top floor, likely the room in question. "Do you have other lodgers currently, Mrs. Whittaker?" Holmes asked as they stepped into the warmth of the entrance hall. "Yes, 4 others besides Mr. Finch," she replied, removing her snow-dampened hat. 2 are elderly sisters who rarely venture out, especially in this weather. The other 2 are university students who are currently away visiting family for the winter holiday. The entrance hall was welcoming, with a polished wooden floor partially covered by a Turkish carpet showing minimal wear, suggesting either recent acquisition or fastidious care. A grandfather clock ticked reassuringly in the corner, and the air carried the commingled scents of beeswax polish, lingering dinner aromas, and the distinctly British remedy for winter chill, a well-stoked coal fire. "This way, gentlemen," Mrs. Whittaker said, leading them up a carpeted staircase that creaked slightly beneath their weight. As they ascended to the 3rd floor, Holmes noted the dropping temperature, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced as they approached Mr. Finch's room at the end of the corridor. The gas lamps along the hallway burned with a steady flame, providing adequate light by which to navigate, yet somehow their warmth seemed diminished, as if the very air resisted heating. Mrs. Whittaker stopped before a solid oak door, unremarkable except for the small brass number 7 affixed at eye level. "This is Mr. Finch's room," she said, her breath visibly condensing in the air before her, an alarming sight inside a heated house. Holmes extended his hand toward the door, without touching it, feeling the aura of cold that emanated from the wood. "Extraordinary," he murmured, his scientific mind already cycling through possible explanations, each more unlikely than the last. Dr. Watson touched the wall adjacent to the doorframe and withdrew his fingers quickly. "The cold is spreading to the surrounding structure," he observed, his medical training evident in his precise assessment. "This is not simply a draught from an open window, Holmes." Holmes nodded in agreement, then pressed his ear to the door, closing his eyes to better focus his hearing. After a long moment, he straightened, his expression grave. "Mrs. Whittaker, I believe we must enter this room immediately. The circumstances suggest your lodger may be in grave danger, if he is not already beyond our help." The landlady's face paled, but she nodded resolutely, producing a ring of keys from her pocket. "As I mentioned, I fear the door is locked from within, but we can try." She inserted the key into the lock and attempted to turn it, confirming her earlier statement. The mechanism was blocked. "Stand aside, please," Holmes requested calmly. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small leather case containing various specialized tools. Selecting a thin metal implement, he inserted it alongside the key and manipulated it with expert precision. "Watson, when I give the word, apply your shoulder to the door. Mrs. Whittaker, I suggest you prepare yourself for what we might discover. The unusual cold suggests conditions inside may be difficult to comprehend." Watson positioned himself as instructed, his face set in determined lines. Mrs. Whittaker took several steps back, her hand pressed to her mouth in anticipation. With a subtle click that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed corridor, Holmes withdrew his tool. "Now, Watson." The doctor threw his weight against the door, which gave way with a splintering crack, swinging inward to reveal a scene that caused all three to momentarily freeze in astonishment. A blast of Arctic air rushed past them, carrying crystalline particles that glittered in the gaslight like diamond dust. Beyond the threshold lay a room transformed into a winter tableau, so perfect and still it might have been a painting, if not for the unmistakable horror at its centre. The door swung wide, revealing a scene of impossible winter. The room beyond the threshold had been transformed into a miniature Arctic landscape, every surface glazed with a thick coating of ice that sparkled with cold brilliance in the gaslight from the hallway. Frost patterns spiraled across the wallpaper in elaborate crystalline formations, while icicles hung from the edges of the writing desk and bookshelf like silent stalactites. The window was sealed with ice so thick it rendered the glass opaque, blocking all view to the London street below. Even the oil lamp on the bedside table was encased in a perfect crystal shell, its flame long extinguished. And there, seated at his desk as if frozen mid-thought, was Edwin Finch. "Good God," Watson breathed, his words materializing as a cloud of vapor before his face. The lodger sat perfectly still, his back rigid, one hand poised over a notebook as if he had been writing when overtaken by the cold. His skin had an unnatural bluish tint, and his eyes, open and staring at nothing, had a glassy, frosted quality that Watson recognized immediately as the unmistakable signature of death. Mrs. Whittaker released a strangled gasp, clinging to the doorframe for support. "Mr. Finch," she cried, instinctively moving forward. Holmes caught her arm, gently but firmly. "Please, Mrs. Whittaker, remain in the hallway for the moment. Watson?" The doctor had already slipped into his professional demeanour, approaching the frozen figure cautiously. The floor crackled beneath his feet, the carpet stiff with frost. He reached for the man's wrist, his physician's instinct overriding the obvious, but withdrew his fingers almost immediately. "He's solid ice, Holmes," Watson said, his voice low with disbelief. "Frozen through, not merely superficially. I've seen frostbite victims in Afghanistan when men fell asleep in mountain passes, but nothing like this." He glanced back at his friend, medical bewilderment evident in his expression. "It's as if he's been subjected to temperatures far below anything naturally occurring in England, or indeed anywhere in Europe." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes surveying the room with methodical precision. "Observe, Watson, how the ice is thickest around the edges of the room, the door, the windows, the walls, and progressively thinner toward the centre. Almost as if the cold originated from outside the room and penetrated inward," Watson finished, following Holmes' reasoning. "Precisely. And yet, paradoxically, the door was locked from within, and the windows appear to have been sealed with ice from the inside." Holmes moved carefully around the perimeter of the room, his breath forming clouds that lingered in the still air. "Most curious." Mrs. Whittaker remained in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth in horror. "Should I call the police, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes considered this briefly. "Not yet, Mrs. Whittaker. What we have here defies conventional explanation, and I fear the good inspectors of Scotland Yard would be more hindrance than help, at this juncture. Watson and I need time to examine this scene properly before it is disturbed by well-meaning but heavy-handed officials." He glanced at her sympathetically. "However, if you would be so kind as to ensure your other lodgers remain unaware of the situation for now, it would be most helpful." The landlady nodded numbly and retreated down the hallway, the shock evident in her unsteady gait. As soon as she was out of earshot, Holmes turned to Watson, his expression suddenly animated with intellectual fervour. "Have you ever seen anything like this, Watson? The man appears to have been flash-frozen, yet the process must have been gradual enough that he remained at his desk, writing until the end." Watson shook his head, professional fascination momentarily overriding his horror. Never, even in the most extreme cold, a human body doesn't freeze solid like this. There would be different stages of tissue death, evidence of the victim attempting to warm himself. He gestured to the empty fireplace across the room. "There's coal and kindling laid, but no evidence he tried to light it. Indeed, and look here." Holmes pointed to a teacup on the desk beside Finch's frozen hand. Tea, frozen solid mid-ripple, as if a sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature occurred while he was working. The detective moved to examine the windows, which were sealed with a thick layer of ice. Using the handle of his walking stick, he tapped experimentally at the frozen glass. "The ice formed from the inside, Watson. See how the crystals grow outward from the interior surface." Watson joined him at the window, noting the pattern Holmes indicated. "But how is that possible? For ice to form in this manner, the temperature inside the room would need to be substantially colder than outside, even accounting for this bitter winter." "Exactly so," Holmes murmured, his voice taking on the distant quality it often assumed when his mind was racing ahead of his words. He turned abruptly, surveying the frozen tableau with fresh intensity. "What do we know of Edwin Finch beyond Mrs. Whittaker's account? He was a researcher, with connections to Oxford and possibly the Royal Society. The evidence suggests a man of scientific inclination." Holmes began to circle the room methodically, his gaze catching on details others might overlook. The bookshelf, though iced over, revealed titles on chemistry, thermodynamics, and several foreign scientific journals. On the wall hung a framed certificate from the Royal Society, the glass frosted, but the text still legible, commending Finch for contributions to the study of gas properties. "Watson, look at this," Holmes called, carefully approaching the writing desk where Finch sat frozen. With delicate precision, he leaned over the dead man's shoulder to examine the notebook that lay open before him. The pages were stiff with frost, but the writing was still visible. A tight, precise hand that filled the page with chemical formulae and hurried notations. "These appear to be experimental notes," Holmes observed, squinting to read through the layer of frost. "References to rapid thermal extraction and compressed gas expansion rates. Our Mr. Finch was working on something rather specific, it seems." Watson, meanwhile, had turned his attention to a small cabinet in the corner of the room, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, partially obscured by ice, were several glass vials of varying sizes, some empty, others containing frozen substances of different colours. Beside these stood a contraption that resembled a modified pressure cooker connected to a series of copper tubes and valves. "Holmes," he called, "I believe our researcher was conducting experiments in this very room." The detective joined him, examining the improvised laboratory with evident interest. Home experimentation, the refuge of the dedicated scientists working with limited means, or, perhaps more tellingly, one who wishes to avoid institutional oversight. He carefully lifted one of the frozen vials, holding it up to catch the light. This residue appears to be some form of chemical compound I'm not immediately familiar with. A sudden, sharp crack from the direction of the desk caused both men to turn. A thin fissure had appeared in the ice encasing Finch's right arm, the changing temperature of the room already beginning to affect the frozen tableau. "We must work quickly, Watson," Holmes said, urgency now evident in his voice. "This scene will not remain preserved for long once exposed to the warmer air from the hallway." With practiced efficiency, Holmes began to document the scene, jotting observations in his notebook, while Watson examined the body as best he could, without disturbing it. The doctor's experienced hands moved carefully over the frozen form, his medical training allowing him to note details that might escape even Holmes's keen eye. "Fascinating," Watson murmured after several minutes of examination. "There are no signs of struggle or distress, no contorted facial expression, no indication he was aware of his fate until, perhaps, the very end." He pointed to Finch's eyes, still open and frosted over. "The pupils are dilated, suggesting sudden shock or realization, but his posture remained composed. Whatever happened here, it occurred with remarkable speed." Holmes, meanwhile, had discovered a small metal box tucked beneath the bed, its lock already compromised by the expanding ice. Inside were several letters, their paper crackling with frost as he carefully unfolded them. "Watson, listen to this," he said, holding a letter close to read in the dim light. "Your research has progressed beyond acceptable parameters. Demonstration required or consequences will follow." It's unsigned, dated 3 weeks ago. He selected another. "Final warning. The Society requires proof of concept by Tuesday next. Failure will result in termination of all arrangements." "Blackmail?" Watson suggested, joining Holmes by the bed. "It would appear so," Holmes agreed, replacing the letters in the box. "Someone was pressuring Finch to produce results, and the deadline coincides with the day Mrs. Whittaker last saw him alive." He straightened, brushing ice crystals from his coat. "I believe our Mr. Finch was developing something of significant value, something others were most eager to acquire." A soft sound from the doorway announced Mrs. Whittaker's return. She stood there, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders against the cold emanating from the room. "Mr. Holmes, what happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson before responding. "Mrs. Whittaker, I believe your lodger was the victim of his own creation, a substance capable of producing extreme cold. Whether by accident or design, he appears to have been trapped in this room as the temperature plummeted to levels that should be impossible to achieve outside a specialized laboratory." The landlady's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting he experimented on himself?" "Not willingly, I suspect," Holmes replied, his tone gentle but firm. "The evidence points to coercion. Mr. Finch was being pressured to demonstrate his research, possibly against his better judgment." He gestured to the frozen scene. "What we see here may well be the result of that pressure, a demonstration gone catastrophically wrong, or perhaps—" He paused, a new thought visibly forming. "Perhaps what, Mr. Holmes?" Mrs. Whittaker prompted. Perhaps a final act of defiance, Holmes finished quietly. Rather than surrender his research to those who would misuse it, he may have chosen to destroy both it and himself. Watson looked skeptical. Suicide, Holmes? The man appears to have been writing calmly at his desk when overtaken by the cold. Not suicide in the conventional sense, Watson, Holmes clarified. Rather, a calculated sacrifice. Note how the windows and door were sealed from within, not to keep something out, but to keep something in. He turned back to Mrs. Whittaker. Madam, did Mr. Finch receive any visitors on his final day? The day you described him as unusually agitated? The landlady considered this, her forehead creasing with concentration. Now that you mention it, yes. A man called in the late afternoon, tall, distinguished-looking, though, as I said, he kept his collar up and hat low. They spoke briefly in the entryway before Mr. Finch asked that they continue their conversation in his room. When the gentleman left, perhaps half an hour later, he seemed satisfied, almost smug, I would say. And Mr. Finch? Thoroughly disturbed. He barely acknowledged me as he rushed back upstairs. That was the last I saw of him. Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed a theory already forming in his mind. Mrs. Whittaker, I believe it is now appropriate to notify the authorities. However, given the unusual nature of this case, I would recommend contacting Inspector Lestrade specifically. He withdrew a card from his coat pocket. This is his direct address at Scotland Yard. If you would be so kind as to send a messenger with my compliments. As Mrs. Whittaker departed on this errand, Holmes turned back to the frozen room, his expression grave. Watson, I fear what we have stumbled upon is more significant than a mere scientific accident. If I am correct, Mr. Finch had developed a method of producing extreme cold through some form of gas or chemical reaction, a technology with potentially devastating applications. Watson followed his reasoning immediately. A weapon, you mean? Something that could freeze a solid man in his own room. Precisely. Imagine such a substance deployed in a confined space. A bank vault during a robbery, perhaps, or a government building during a sensitive meeting. The potential for both criminal and military applications would be enormous. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the icebound room once more, and someone was very interested in acquiring it. The two friends worked methodically for the next hour, Holmes documenting every detail of the frozen scene, while Watson continued his examination of the body, which had begun to thaw slightly, tiny rivulets of water tracing paths through the ice. The condition of the tissue is remarkable, Holmes, Watson observed, carefully examining Finch's hands. Despite being frozen solid, there's minimal cellular damage visible to the naked eye. In medical science, this would be revolutionary, the ability to preserve tissue so perfectly, which would make it all the more valuable to certain interests, Holmes replied, carefully removing a small sample of ice from the windowsill and sealing it in a glass vial from his pocket. I intend to analyze this at Baker Street. Perhaps it will yield clues to the composition of whatever substance caused this phenomenon. A commotion from downstairs announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade and his men. Holmes quickly finished his examination of Finch's notebook, committing several key passages to memory before the inevitably heavy-handed official investigation would begin. Lestrade appeared in the doorway, his habitually skeptical expression giving way to genuine astonishment as he took in the frozen scene. "Good Lord," he exclaimed, his breath visible in the still, frigid air. "What in heaven's name happened here, Mr. Holmes?" "A new kind of crime, Inspector," Holmes replied gravely. "One that harnesses the power of science for malevolent purposes. This man," he gestured to the frozen figure of Edwin Finch, "was developing a substance capable of producing extreme cold, likely through rapid gas expansion. He was being pressured to demonstrate it, possibly by individuals with criminal intent." Lestrade's eyes narrowed as he stepped cautiously into the room, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "And you believe he was murdered using his own invention? That's a bit far-fetched, even for you, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary, Inspector, it is the only explanation that fits the facts," Holmes countered smoothly. "The door locked from within, yet the victim made no attempt to escape or warm himself. The windows are sealed with ice from the inside, and most tellingly, he pointed to the notebook on the desk. His final notations indicate he was aware of what was happening. The last legible entry reads, 'Valve compromised, pressure dropping, temperature falling rapidly, they've done it.' Not the words of a man conducting a voluntary experiment. Wouldn't you agree?" Lestrade frowned, processing this information. "So you suggest someone tampered with his equipment, causing it to malfunction while he was working?" "Precisely. Someone with knowledge of his research and access to his room. Someone who visited shortly before the incident occurred." Holmes gestured to the apparatus in the cabinet. "This device appears to have been modified. Note the newer fittings on these valves, distinct from the older components." "The visitor Mrs. Whittaker mentioned," Watson added. "The tall man who left, looking satisfied." Holmes nodded. "I believe this individual made subtle but critical alterations to Finch's equipment, ensuring it would fail catastrophically when next used. A clever murder, designed to appear as a tragic accident, the scientist killed by his own creation." Lestrade sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair. "Well, Mr. Holmes, it's certainly one of the strangest cases I've encountered. I'll have my men secure the scene and arrange for the body to be transported once it's thawed sufficiently for movement." He glanced uncomfortably at the frozen figure. "Will you continue your involvement?" "Most definitely, Inspector," Holmes replied with quiet intensity. "This case has implications far beyond the death of a single researcher. If the technology that caused this exists and falls into the wrong hands, we may be facing a new and terrible kind of weapon." He turned to Watson. "Come, my friend. We have work to do at Baker Street. I need to analyze these samples and begin tracking the movements of our mysterious tall visitor." As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Whittaker approached them in the hallway, her face drawn with concern. "Mr. Holmes, there is something else you should know. After you arrived, I recalled something unusual. 2 days before Mr. Finch's seclusion, a package was delivered for him. A small wooden crate, quite heavy for its size. The delivery man insisted it be taken directly to Mr. Finch's room, rather than left with me as was customary." Holmes's interest visibly piqued. "Did you happen to notice any markings on this crate? A sender's address, perhaps?" "Only a symbol," she replied, drawing it in the air with her finger. "A circle with what looked like a snowflake inside. I thought it was strange at the time, but Mr. Finch seemed to be expecting it." Holmes and Watson exchanged meaningful glances. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. That may prove most illuminating." Holmes took her hand briefly. "You've been most helpful. Inspector Lestrade will need your assistance with some formalities, but please don't hesitate to contact me at Baker Street should you recall anything else, no matter how insignificant it may seem." As they descended the stairs, Watson leaned close to Holmes. "A snowflake symbol, Holmes. Rather on the nose, wouldn't you say?" "Perhaps deliberately so," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "Organizations often choose symbols that reflect their purpose, while remaining sufficiently ambiguous to avoid unwanted attention." He pulled his coat tighter as they stepped into the snowy night. "One thing is certain, Watson. Somewhere in London there exists a group with the knowledge and ability to create a substance that can freeze a solid man in his own room, and they were willing to kill to obtain it." Watson shuddered, and not entirely from the winter cold. "What do you make of Finch's final words? They've done it." "Done what, exactly?" Holmes's expression was grim. He raised his hand to hail a passing cab. "I believe they've successfully weaponized his research, Watson. The question now is, what do they intend to do with it?" The cab pulled up alongside them, snow crunching beneath its wheels. As they climbed in, Holmes cast one last look at the Bloomsbury boarding house, its windows glowing warmly against the night. All except for one on the third floor, still dark and shrouded in unnatural frost. Whatever forces had been set in motion within those walls, Holmes was determined to uncover them before London faced a winter more deadly than any it had known before. "Baker Street," he instructed the driver, settling back into the seat beside his friend, as the cab pulled away into the swirling snow, leaving behind a mystery as cold and perplexing as the frozen lodger himself. The journey back to Baker Street was conducted largely in silence, each man lost in contemplation of the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Outside the cab window, London lay wrapped in winter's embrace, gas lamps creating halos of amber light that penetrated the gently falling snow. The streets were nearly deserted at this hour, the occasional pedestrian hurrying along with collar turned up against the biting cold, unaware that somewhere in the city lurked a cold infinitely more terrible than nature's own. Holmes sat with his eyes half closed, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin in that familiar posture of deep thought. Watson knew better than to disturb him at such moments, when his friend's remarkable mind was sorting through facts, discarding irrelevancies, and constructing those ingenious chains of deduction that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. Instead, the doctor watched the passing scenery, his medical training still grappling with the physiological impossibility of what they had discovered in Edwin Finch's room. By the time they reached 221B, the mantel clock was striking 11. Mrs. Hudson had indeed not waited up, but had left a covered tray of sandwiches and a pot of tea that could easily be reheated on the fire. Watson busied himself with this task, while Holmes immediately set to work at the chemistry table that occupied one corner of their sitting room, carefully removing the samples he had collected from his coat pockets. "I confess, Holmes," Watson said as he stoked the fire to life, "I'm struggling to comprehend the science behind what we witnessed. Even in the most extreme natural conditions, Arctic expeditions, the highest mountain passes, I've never heard of a human body freezing so completely, so rapidly." Holmes nodded absently, already absorbed in his examination of the ice sample under his microscope. "Because it isn't natural, Watson. What we observed was the result of artificially induced conditions, a targeted application of thermodynamic principles that goes well beyond anything currently acknowledged in mainstream scientific literature. He adjusted the microscope's focus, his expression intensifying. Most fascinating. The crystalline structure of this ice is unlike anything I've encountered before. The molecular arrangement suggests flash freezing at temperatures far below zero, perhaps -40 degrees or lower. Watson brought the teapot to the table, pouring 2 cups before settling into his armchair. But how could such temperatures be achieved in an ordinary lodging house room? It defies all practical understanding of thermodynamics. Ah, but that's precisely what makes it so brilliant and so dangerous, Holmes replied, finally looking up from his microscope. Consider, Watson, what do we know about gases under pressure? The doctor thought for a moment. When compressed gases are suddenly released, they expand rapidly and absorb heat from the surrounding environment, producing a cooling effect. It's the principle behind modern refrigeration experiments. Exactly so, Holmes said with an approving nod. Now imagine that principle magnified exponentially, a gas specifically formulated to maximize this effect, compressed to extraordinary pressures, then released in a controlled environment. Watson's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You believe Finch had created such a substance? A gas that, when released, could instantly freeze everything in its vicinity? I do. Holmes rose, pacing the room as he often did when organizing his thoughts. The evidence points to a breakthrough in cryogenic science, one with staggering implications. Think of it, Watson. A weapon that kills without a sound, leaves no traditional evidence, and could potentially be deployed in countless scenarios. He paused by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street below. Bank vaults rendered instantly accessible by freezing and shattering locks. Political assassinations conducted with no trace of poison or violence. Military applications where entire enemy positions could be neutralized without firing a shot. Watson shuddered, setting down his teacup. No wonder someone was willing to kill for it. But who, Holmes? Who would have both the scientific knowledge to understand the value of Finch's work and the ruthlessness to murder for it? Holmes turned from the window, his expression grave. That, my dear Watson, is the question we must answer with all possible haste. For whoever now possesses this technology has the capacity to commit crimes beyond anything London has witnessed before. He returned to the chemistry table, selecting a small glass tube from his collection. I intend to subject this ice sample to various tests. Perhaps its composition will provide clues to the specific formula Finch had developed. As Holmes set to work with his chemicals and apparatus, Watson retrieved his medical bag, extracting his notebook. While you conduct your analysis, I'll document my observations of the body from a medical perspective. There may be details I observed that could prove relevant. For the next hour, the sitting room of 224B Baker Street resembled a peculiar hybrid of scientific laboratory and medical office. Holmes moved between microscope and test tubes with practiced efficiency, occasionally muttering observations to himself, while Watson filled page after page with detailed notes on the extraordinary preservation of Edwin Finch's frozen form. Watson, Holmes called suddenly, beckoning his friend to join him at the table. Observe this reaction. The doctor moved to Holmes's side, watching as the detective added a drop of clear solution to a test tube containing melted ice from the scene. The liquid immediately turned a vibrant blue, then faded to pale green. What does it signify? Watson asked, intrigued. This reagent reacts specifically with certain nitrogen compounds, Holmes explained, his voice animated with discovery. The color change indicates the presence of a substance I've encountered only in theoretical papers from the Royal Society. A modified form of nitrogen that remains stable at room temperature, but undergoes rapid state changes when triggered by a catalyst. He set down the test tube carefully. If I'm correct, Finch had developed a two-component system, a pressurized gas that, when combined with a catalyst, would create a cascading reaction resulting in extreme, localized temperature reduction. Watson considered this. And you believe someone tampered with this system, causing it to activate while Finch was working at his desk? Precisely. Holmes moved to the fireplace, picking up his pipe from the mantelpiece. The visitor Mrs. Whittaker described, the tall man with upturned collar, must have modified the apparatus during his visit, perhaps installing a delayed trigger mechanism that would activate once he was safely away. As Holmes packed his pipe with tobacco, Watson returned to his notes. There's another aspect of this case that troubles me, Holmes. The physical state of the body defies medical explanation. The freezing appears to have occurred so rapidly that there was minimal tissue damage, none of the cellular rupturing typically associated with freezing. An observation of considerable significance, Holmes agreed, lighting his pipe. It suggests Finch's technology could have legitimate scientific applications beyond weaponry. Medical preservation, for instance. The ability to freeze biological material without damage would revolutionize certain fields of medicine and research. Watson nodded thoughtfully. Which would make it even more valuable, and provide motive for multiple parties to seek control of it. A comfortable silence fell between them, as Holmes smoked contemplatively, and Watson continued reviewing his notes. Outside, the snow had ceased falling, and a thin crescent moon occasionally emerged from behind scudding clouds, casting silver light across the frozen London landscape. "I believe we should return to the scene tomorrow, Watson," Holmes said at length, tapping his pipe against the grate. "The body will have thawed further by then, allowing for a more thorough examination. Moreover, I'm particularly interested in that wooden crate Mrs. Whittaker mentioned, the one bearing the snowflake symbol. You suspect it contained components for Finch's apparatus? Or perhaps the catalyst itself?" Holmes stared into the dying embers of the fire. The timing is suggestive, delivered just 2 days before the incident. Watson yawned despite himself, the lateness of the hour and the day's extraordinary events finally taking their toll. "What of the letters, Holmes, the blackmail notes we found in the metal box? Should we not try to trace their origin?" "Indeed we shall," Holmes replied, noting his friend's fatigue with a small smile. "But that task can wait until morning. For now, I suggest we follow Mrs. Hudson's excellent example and seek some rest. Tomorrow promises to be a demanding day." As Watson bid good night and retired to his room, Holmes remained by the fire, his keen mind still turning over the puzzle pieces of the case. The frozen lodger, the mysterious visitor, the snowflake symbol, the blackmail letters, all elements of a scientific conspiracy with potentially deadly implications for London. He retrieved Edwin Finch's notebook from his coat pocket, having quietly secured it from the scene before Lestrade's arrival. The pages were now mostly thawed, though water damage had rendered some passages illegible. Still, there was enough to confirm his suspicions. Finch had been developing a revolutionary cooling agent, one that operated on principles just beyond the current frontiers of scientific understanding. The final entries were particularly illuminating, documenting the researcher's growing concern that his work was being monitored and his reluctance to demonstrate the technology before proper safety protocols had been established. The very last entry, as Holmes had told Lestrade, read simply, "Valve compromised, pressure dropping, temperature falling rapidly. They've done it." A man's final testament written as the air around him transformed into an Arctic death trap. Holmes closed the notebook carefully. Tomorrow they would return to Bloomsbury, and the hunt for the Icebound lodger's killer would begin in earnest. Morning brought weak winter sunshine that did little to dispel the chill. After a hearty breakfast, Mrs. Hudson insisting they eat properly before venturing out again into the cold, Holmes and Watson found themselves once more in a cab, bound for the Bloomsbury boarding house. "I've been thinking about the snowflake symbol, Holmes," Watson said as they travelled. "Could it be connected to any known criminal organization?" Holmes shook his head. "None in my extensive catalogue. This appears to be something new, or perhaps so exclusive and secretive that it has escaped even my attention until now. A scientific cabal, perhaps? Researchers working outside institutional boundaries?" "A reasonable hypothesis," Holmes agreed. "The advancement of science has always attracted those who chafe against conventional limitations, both ethical and methodological. It would not be the first time brilliant minds have been seduced by the promise of unrestricted research." As they approached Mrs. Whittaker's establishment, they observed increased activity. A police carriage stood outside, and 2 constables flanked the entrance, keeping curious onlookers at bay. Inside, they found Inspector Lestrade in the hallway outside Finch's room, deep in conversation with a thin, scholarly-looking man whom Holmes immediately recognized as Dr. Anderson from the police surgeon's office. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted them, looking somewhat harried. "I expected you might return. You'll be interested to know the body has thawed significantly overnight. Dr. Anderson has been conducting his examination." "And what conclusions have you reached, Doctor?" Holmes inquired politely, though Watson detected the subtle note in his voice that suggested he anticipated little of value from the official medical examiner. Dr. Anderson adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Most unusual case. Most unusual indeed. The cause of death appears to be rapid freezing of the blood and tissues, resulting in immediate cessation of all bodily functions. I've never seen anything like it." He hesitated. "In fact, Mr. Holmes, I was rather hoping to consult with Dr. Watson on the matter. His experience with unusual conditions during his military service might provide insight my civilian practice lacks." Watson nodded cordially, pleasantly surprised by the professional courtesy. "I would be happy to collaborate, Dr. Anderson." "What of the room itself, Inspector?" Holmes asked, peering past Lestrade into the chamber beyond. "Has anything significant been discovered?" Lestrade sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. "Nothing that makes a lick of sense to me, Mr. Holmes. The ice has mostly melted, leaving everything sodden. We found various scientific apparatus, notebooks filled with formulas and calculations that might as well be ancient Greek to me, and a collection of chemicals I've ordered transferred to our police laboratory for analysis." "And the wooden crate Mrs. Whittaker mentioned, with the snowflake symbol?" "Found it in the wardrobe," Lestrade confirmed. "Empty now, but the symbol is there, right enough, Burned into the wood. I've never seen its like before. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. May I examine it? Be my guest, Lestrade replied, stepping aside. Though I doubt you'll find anything my men haven't already noted. The room, as Lestrade had indicated, bore little resemblance to the Arctic scene of the previous night. The ice had melted, leaving the carpet squelching underfoot and the wallpaper peeling in sodden sheets. The air held the unpleasant musty odour of damp paper and fabric, overlaid with a faint chemical scent that Holmes immediately noted was similar to, but distinct from, a common refrigerants. Edwin Finch's body had been removed, presumably to the police mortuary for further examination, but the desk where he had sat remained in place, water pooled on its surface. Holmes moved directly to the wardrobe in the corner, which stood open to reveal a jumble of modest clothing and, on the floor, a wooden crate approximately 2 feet square. He knelt beside it, running his fingers over the branded symbol, a perfect circle containing an intricate, geometrically precise snowflake design, with 6 identical arms radiating from a hexagonal center. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than the others. The precision of this mark suggests industrial manufacturing rather than handcrafting. The depth of the burn is uniform throughout, indicating mechanical application rather than a manually operated branding iron. His fingers explored the interior of the crate, noting the impressions in the wood where objects had been secured during transport. This held cylindrical objects, 3 of them, each approximately 8 inches in length and 2 inches in diameter, likely metal, given the compression marks in the wood grain. Gas canisters? Watson suggested, joining Holmes by the wardrobe. Very possibly, Holmes agreed. And observe these smaller indentations, 4 of them, square-shaped. Boxes, perhaps, containing the catalyst or triggering mechanism. He stood, dusting off his knees. Inspector, I would be most interested in examining Mr. Finch's correspondence. Were any letters or telegrams found among his effects? Several, Lestrade confirmed. Most seemed ordinary enough. Communications from scientific colleagues, receipts, that sort of thing. The blackmail letters you mentioned were there too, of course. My men have catalogued everything. And visitors? Did Mrs. Whittaker provide any further information about individuals who called upon Mr. Finch in the weeks before his death? She mentioned a younger man who visited occasionally, described him as scholarly, mid-20s, with wire-rimmed spectacles. And of course, the tall gentleman with the upturned collar who was the last to see Finch alive. Lestrade checked his notebook. No names for either, unfortunately. Finch never introduced them to his landlady. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, moving to the desk where Finch had met his end. Unlike the previous night, when the researcher had been frozen in place, the chair now stood empty, a vacant throne before a ruined kingdom of sodden papers and warped wood. With careful precision, Holmes began to sort through the waterlogged documents, handling the fragile pages with extraordinary delicacy. Most were damaged beyond readability, the ink having run into blue-black pools that obscured whatever information they had once contained. A few, however, had survived, with portions still legible. "Watson, look here," Holmes said, carefully separating a sheet that had been partially protected by others, layered atop it. A letterhead, still visible. Institute for Thermal Research, Oxford. An organisation I'm not familiar with. Watson peered at the document. The date is recent, just 3 weeks ago. Something about Recent advances and practical demonstration required. Most interesting. Holmes set the page aside carefully. And here, a partial list of names, associates perhaps, or fellow researchers. He squinted at the faded ink. I can make out Chambers, Harrington, and Villiers. The rest are illegible. While Holmes continued his meticulous examination of the desk, Watson wandered to the small laboratory setup in the corner. The apparatus Holmes had identified the previous night, the modified pressure cooker with copper tubing, had been dismantled by the police, its components arranged on a small table for documentation. "Holmes," Watson called, "come look at this valve. There's something unusual about it." The detective joined him, bending to examine the metal component Watson indicated. It was a brass valve of intricate design, clearly newer than the other parts of the apparatus. "Excellent observation, Watson," Holmes said appreciatively. "This valve has indeed been modified. See these tool marks? They indicate recent tampering. And look here." He pointed to a tiny mechanism concealed within the valve housing. A timing device designed to trigger the valve's release at a specific moment. So our tall visitor installed this replacement valve during his meeting with Finch, Watson concluded, set to activate after he had departed. Precisely. A coldly calculated murder, if you'll forgive the unfortunate pun. Holmes straightened. This confirms our theory. The question remains, who is this man, and what organization does he represent? Lestrade had joined them, listening to this exchange with growing concern. You truly believe this was a deliberate act, then? Haven't some experiments gone wrong? I am convinced of it, Inspector, Holmes replied firmly. Edwin Finch was murdered for his scientific breakthrough, a technology that could quite literally freeze a man to death without leaving conventional evidence. The perfect murder weapon, one might say. The inspector frowned deeply. Then, we must identify this tall visitor as quickly as possible. I'll have my men canvass the neighborhood, see if anyone notices him entering or leaving the boarding house. A sensible approach, Holmes agreed, though I suspect our quarry is far too careful to have been easily observed. Nevertheless, we must pursue every avenue of investigation. He turned to Watson. I believe our next step should be Oxford, my friend. This Institute for Thermal Research warrants closer examination. I shall accompany Dr. Anderson to the mortuary first, if you don't mind, Watson replied. I'm quite interested in his findings regarding the body's condition. Perhaps there are medical clues we've overlooked. An excellent suggestion, Holmes concurred. I shall remain here a while longer to complete my examination of the scene. Shall we meet at Baker Street this evening to compare our discoveries? As Watson departed with Dr. Anderson, Holmes returned to his methodical investigation of Finch's room. Beyond the scientific apparatus and papers, there were personal effects to consider. Clothing, books, the modest possessions of a dedicated researcher living within limited means. Sometimes, Holmes knew, the most revealing clues lay not in the extraordinary elements of a case, but in the ordinary details of a victim's daily existence. He examined the bookshelf carefully, noting the well-worn spines of scientific texts interspersed with a few volumes of poetry, Tennyson and Wordsworth primarily, both showing signs of frequent reading. A man of scientific mind, but poetic soul, then. On the bedside table lay a small photograph in a silver frame, a woman of middle age with kind eyes and Finch's same scholarly bearing. His mother, perhaps, or an older sister. It was these human touches that reminded Holmes of what was truly at stake in this investigation. Not merely the pursuit of a fascinating scientific mystery, but justice for a man whose life had been cut short by those who valued his brilliance only for its potential as a weapon. As he continued his search, Holmes reflected on the dangerous path that lay ahead. Whoever had orchestrated Finch's murder had demonstrated both advanced scientific knowledge and a ruthless disregard for human life. They now possessed a technology that could kill silently, leaving little trace for conventional police work to follow. It would require all his deductive powers, and perhaps a measure of the luck that occasionally favours the determined investigator, to prevent this freezing death from becoming London's newest terror. The afternoon light was already fading into London's premature winter dusk as Holmes completed his examination of Edwin Finch's room. He had filled several pages of his notebook with observations, sketches, and calculations, pausing occasionally to test various residues found among the scientific apparatus with small vials of chemicals he carried in his coat pocket. Inspector Lestrade had departed an hour earlier, called away to Scotland Yard to brief his superiors on the unusual case, leaving a constable posted at the door with instructions to assist Mr. Holmes in any way required. Holmes had taken full advantage of this arrangement, methodically documenting every aspect of the room that might yield insight into the murdered scientist's work and life. His most significant discovery had come in the form of a small leather journal wedged behind the wardrobe, overlooked by the police in their initial search. Unlike the notebooks on the desk, this journal appeared to be a personal diary, rather than scientific documentation, and had been partially protected from the melting ice by its position. Now, as Holmes prepared to leave, he carefully wrapped this prize in his handkerchief and placed it in an inner pocket, anticipating that Finch's private thoughts might provide context that his scientific notes could not. "I've completed my examination, Constable," Holmes informed the young officer at the door. "Please convey to Inspector Lestrade that I'll be in touch shortly with my preliminary conclusions." "Yes, sir, Mr. Holmes," the constable replied with the respect Lestrade's men invariably showed the consulting detective, despite his unofficial status. "Will Dr. Watson be returning as well?" "Not today, I expect," Holmes answered, donning his hat and gloves. "The good doctor is currently at the mortuary, lending his expertise to the medical examination." Holmes departed the boarding-house, nodding politely to Mrs. Whittaker as he passed through the entrance hall. The poor woman looked thoroughly worn by the events of the past 24 hours, the shock of discovering her lodger's frozen corpse, compounded by the subsequent police activity, and the unsettling realization that a murderer had walked unchallenged through her respectable establishment. Outside, the temperature had dropped further as evening approached, and Holmes's breath formed clouds in the air as he walked briskly toward the main thoroughfare to find a cab. The chill reminded him uncomfortably of the Arctic atmosphere in Finch's room the previous night, though this was merely the natural cold of a London winter, not the deadly, artificial freeze that had claimed the scientist's life. His mind was already sorting through the evidence, arranging facts into their logical sequence, when a movement across the street caught his attention. A tall figure in a dark coat with the collar turned up against the cold stood partially obscured by a leafless plane tree, apparently watching the boarding-house. As Holmes paused, the figure turned and strode swiftly away, disappearing around a corner before Holmes could cross the busy street in pursuit. "Interesting," Holmes murmured to himself. Our mysterious visitor returns to the scene, a common enough behaviour among criminals, but particularly telling in this case. He hailed a passing cab, instructing the driver to take him to the telegraph office before continuing to Baker Street. There were inquiries to be made regarding the Institute for Thermal Research at Oxford, and Holmes preferred the immediacy of the telegraph for such time-sensitive matters. At the telegraph office, Holmes composed 3 separate messages, one to an academic contact at Oxford University, requesting information on the Institute and its members, another to his brother Mycroft, whose position in the government might provide insight into any official interest in cryogenic research, and a third to a chemical supplier in London who had occasionally assisted him in identifying unusual substances. With these inquiries dispatched, Holmes directed the cabby to continue to Baker Street, where he anticipated Watson would soon join him to share what he had learned at the mortuary. The familiar sitting room at 221B welcomed Holmes with its comfortable disorder and lingering aroma of tobacco smoke. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray with a pot of tea and some freshly baked scones, correctly anticipating that her lodger would return chilled from his investigations. Holmes poured himself a cup, added a generous spoonful of sugar, and settled into his armchair to examine his prize from the boarding-house, Edwin Finch's personal journal. The leather-bound book was still damp, requiring careful handling to prevent further damage to the pages. Holmes delicately separated each leaf, scanning the entries written in Finch's precise hand. The earliest dated from approximately 6 months prior, coinciding with the beginning of his residence at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding-house. The initial entries were largely mundane, observations about his new accommodations, notes on his ongoing research, occasional comments about the weather, or a particularly satisfying meal. As Holmes progressed through the journal, however, a narrative began to emerge that aligned with their developing theory of the case. July 15th, 1895, made a significant breakthrough today with the nitrogen compound. When combined with the modified catalyst, it achieved temperature reduction of approximately 65 degrees in laboratory conditions. Must refine the delivery mechanism before presenting findings to the Institute. August 3rd, 1895, received communication from H expressing interest in practical applications. Reminded him that the research remains theoretical at this stage and requires extensive safety testing. His response was unsettlingly insistent. September 12th, 1895. Young C visited today to discuss collaboration. His enthusiasm is refreshing, but I remain cautious about expanding the circle of those aware of my work. The potential for misuse grows with each person who knows the details of the compound. The entries continued in this vein, documenting Finch's growing concerns about external interest in his research, particularly from an individual consistently referred to only as H. By November, the tone had shifted notably. November 2nd, 1895. Another letter from H today, bordering on threatening. He claims the Institute's patience is wearing thin, and that they have the right to examine my work in detail. I begin to suspect the Institute is not what it purports to be. November 18th, 1895. C came with a warning today. Says H has connections beyond academic circles, military and criminal both. Advised me to be careful. I am considering destroying my notes and samples, but the potential medical applications are too valuable to abandon entirely. The final entries were particularly revealing. December 5th, 1895. Package arrived today. Components I ordered, but modified somehow. The valves appear different from my specifications. C suggests I not use them, says he's heard rumours of similar accidents among researchers who resisted H's demands. December 8th, 1895, H himself visited Today, insisted on seeing the apparatus. I showed him the basic setup, but claimed the compound itself was still being refined. He seemed satisfied, but I detected something calculating in his manner. Must dismantle everything tonight and relocate. This place is no longer safe. This was the final entry, dated the day before Mrs. Whittaker had last seen Finch alive. Holmes closed the journal thoughtfully, the narrative now significantly clearer. Finch had developed a remarkable cooling technology, but had grown increasingly concerned about interest from parties who might weaponize it. He had planned to disappear with his research, but had delayed too long. The sound of familiar footsteps on the stairs announced Watson's return. The doctor entered, looking weary but intellectually stimulated in the way that complex medical puzzles often affected him. "Ah, Holmes, you're back already," Watson observed, removing his hat and coat. "I've just come from the mortuary. The most extraordinary examination I've ever participated in, I must say." Holmes gestured to the teapot. "Refresh yourself, my friend, and tell me what you've discovered. I've had some success of my own." Watson poured himself tea and settled into his chair with a grateful sigh. Dr. Anderson is quite baffled by the condition of Finch's body, and with good reason. The cellular preservation is unprecedented. In normal freezing deaths, ice crystals form within the cells, rupturing membranes and causing significant tissue damage during thawing. But in Finch's case, the freezing appears to have occurred so rapidly and at such extreme temperatures that the cells were, in essence, perfectly preserved. Suggesting a practical medical application for Finch's technology, Holmes noted. Imagine the implications for surgical practice. Organs preserved indefinitely without deterioration. Precisely, Watson agreed enthusiastically. The medical community would consider it revolutionary. But there's more, Holmes. We found traces of an unusual chemical compound in Finch's lungs and nasal passages, a substance Dr. Anderson couldn't identify with standard tests. The cooling agent itself, Holmes surmised, inhaled as it rapidly filled the room. That would be my conclusion as well. The distribution throughout the bronchial passages suggests he breathed it in during its gaseous state, before the temperature dropped low enough to freeze him solid. Watson shook his head in scientific wonder. The speed at which it must have acted is astonishing. Based on the position of the body and the state of the frozen tea on his desk, he had no time to react. Perhaps only seconds from release of the gas to complete incapacitation. Holmes nodded, considering this information. "My findings complement yours, Watson. I've recovered Finch's personal journal, which documents his growing concern about parties interested in weaponizing his research." He briefly summarized the key entries. "It seems our Mr. Finch was developing a conscience about his creation. Too late, unfortunately, to save his life. This H person must be our tall visitor," Watson reasoned, "and C, the younger man who occasionally called on Finch. But what is this Institute for Thermal Research? I've never heard of it, and I try to keep abreast of medical research developments." "I've sent inquiries to Oxford," Holmes replied. "I suspect we may find it's a front, perhaps a legitimate-seeming entity created to channel funds and resources toward specific research with military potential." Watson frowned. "The military. You believe this might be government-sanctioned work?" "Not officially, perhaps," Holmes said carefully. But there are always elements within any government eager to develop advantages over potential adversaries. A weapon that kills without sound or immediate evidence would certainly qualify. He tapped the journal thoughtfully, though Finch mentions criminal connections as well, which suggests something more complex than straightforward government research. Before Watson could respond, they were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a silver tray with several telegrams. "These just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "The boy said they were most urgent." "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied, already reaching for the first message. As their landlady withdrew, Holmes quickly read through the telegrams, his expression growing more intense with each one. "Well, Watson, we have our answers, or at least some of them," he said, passing the telegrams to his friend. "My Oxford contact reports that no Institute for Thermal Research exists within the university's official structure. However, there is a private research entity using that name, funded primarily by a consortium of industrial interests with significant government contracts." "And the names Finch mentioned?" Watson asked, scanning the messages. "Harrington appears to be Sir James Harrington, nominally a professor of chemistry, but with extensive connections to the War Office. Chambers is likely Dr. Edward Chambers, a young researcher specializing in thermodynamics, perhaps our mysterious C. As for Villiers," Holmes tapped the third telegram. "Mycroft identifies him as Colonel Sebastian Villiers, officially attached to the Royal Engineers but rumoured to be involved in more secretive military research programs." "And H?" Watson pressed. Holmes's expression darkened. "No direct identification, but Mycroft hints at a figure known in certain government circles as the Professor, a scientific consultant who operates in the shadows between official and unofficial channels." Watson looked up sharply. "Surely not Professor Moriarty. I thought his criminal empire had been dismantled after your encounter at Reichenbach Falls." "Not Moriarty himself, no," Holmes assured him. "But perhaps someone of similar intellect and ambition, operating in the specialized realm of military science rather than general criminal enterprise." He rose, moving to the fireplace to fill his pipe, a habit that often accompanied his most concentrated thinking. "Consider the implications, Watson. A weapon that freezes its target instantly, leaving no conventional evidence, perfect for assassinations, for rendering security measures useless, for immobilizing enemies without sound or visible violence, but requiring specialized delivery systems and controlled environments," Watson pointed out. "It's hardly practical for battlefield use." "Not in its current form, perhaps," Holmes conceded. "But technology evolves, Watson. What begins as cumbersome often becomes portable through innovation." He struck a match, lighting his pipe. "And consider the secondary applications, the ability to breach any safe or vault by freezing the metal until it becomes brittle enough to shatter. The implications for both military and criminal use are vast." Watson set the telegrams aside, his expression troubled. "So, Finch developed this technology, then grew concerned about its applications and attempted to withhold it. In response, this H arranged his murder using his own invention, a certain irony there, and now possesses both the formula and the prototype," Holmes concluded grimly. "The question is, what does he intend to do with it?" As if in answer to this rhetorical query, a third interruption came, this time the thundering of feet on the stairs, followed by the breathless appearance of a red-faced constable at their door. "Mr. Holmes," the young officer gasped. Inspector Lestrade sent me to fetch you immediately. There's been another incident, the Bank of England's Threadneedle Street branch. A vault broken into, the guards found. He hesitated, seeming to struggle with the description. Found frozen solid, sir, and the lock shattered like glass. Holmes and Watson exchanged a look of alarm. It begins, Holmes said quietly, already reaching for his coat. Come, Watson, we must see this for ourselves. Within minutes they were in a cab, racing through London's darkening streets toward the financial district, both men silent with the gravity of their thoughts. The weapon had moved from experimental murder to practical application with alarming speed, suggesting a level of planning that boded ill for the city's security. I should have anticipated this, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson. A bank vault is the perfect demonstration of the technology's potential, both as a criminal tool and as a proof of concept for potential military applications. You can hardly blame yourself for not predicting the specific target, Holmes, Watson replied reasonably. The important thing now is to examine this new scene for clues that might lead us to the perpetrators. Holmes nodded absently, his mind already racing ahead to what they might find. The cab turned onto Threadneedle Street, where an unusual amount of activity was visible despite the evening hour. Police carriages stood outside the imposing Bank of England building, their lanterns casting pools of light on the gathering crowd of curious onlookers being held back by constables. Lestrade met them at the entrance, his normally composed features strained with concern. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank heaven you've come. We're completely out of our depth with this one. The guards, Inspector, Holmes inquired immediately. Their condition? Still alive, remarkably, Lestrade replied, as he led them through the bank's marble-floored lobby toward the vault area. Though the doctors say it's touch and go. They were found in time, it seems, frozen but not completely solid, like your Mr. Finch. They've been taken to St. Bartholomew's for treatment. And the vault itself? Holmes pressed. See for yourself, Lestrade said grimly, gesturing ahead as they descended a flight of stairs to the underground level where the main vaults were located. The scene that greeted them was eerily reminiscent of Finch's room, though on a larger scale. Frost covered the walls of the corridor leading to the vault, and the massive steel door, designed to withstand any conventional attempt at forced entry, hung open, its locking mechanism shattered into crystalline fragments that littered the floor like bizarre diamond dust. The internal temperature when we arrived was well below freezing, Lestrade informed them. It's warmed considerably in the hours since, but you can still feel the unnatural chill. Holmes approached the vault door, examining the fractured lock mechanism with intense focus. Precisely as I feared, Watson. The metal was subjected to such extreme cold that it became brittle enough to break under pressure. An elegant solution to the problem of modern security systems. What was taken? Watson asked Lestrade. That's another peculiarity, the inspector replied with a frown. Not currency or gold bullion, as one might expect, but rather specific safety deposit boxes. The bank manager is checking records now to determine the owners. Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed a theory already forming in his mind. Not simple theft, then, but targeted acquisition. The frozen guards and shattered vault are as much a demonstration as a means to an end. A demonstration? To whom? Lestrade asked, bewildered. Holmes's expression was grave as he surveyed the scene. To potential buyers, Inspector. Our murderer has moved from testing his weapon to showcasing its capabilities for those who might pay handsomely for such technology." He turned to Watson, his eyes alight with the determination that always accompanied his most challenging cases. "The game grows more dangerous by the hour, my friend. We must identify this H before his freezing death becomes London's newest commercial." The next morning dawned grey and foreboding, with leaden clouds hanging low over London's chimney tops and a penetrating dampness that seemed to seep through the thickest of coats. Holmes had spent much of the night in silent contemplation, smoking his pipe by the dying embers of the fire, while Watson dozed fitfully in his armchair, neither man willing to retire properly while the case presented such urgent dangers. By the time pale winter light began to filter through the windows of 221B Baker Street, Holmes had formulated a plan of action. He rose, stretching his lean frame to dispel the stiffness of his night-long vigil, and gently roused his companion. "Watson, I believe we must divide our efforts today," he announced as the doctor blinked away his fatigue. "The Bank of England incident confirms our fears. The freezing technology has moved from experimental murder to practical application, and with alarming speed." Watson nodded, suppressing a yawn as he checked his pocket watch. "Not yet 7, he noted. "You've been thinking all night, I see. What's our course?" Holmes moved to the sideboard, pouring 2 cups of coffee from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided before retiring the previous evening. The coffee was no longer hot, but it remained strong and reviving. "I must examine the safety deposit boxes that were targeted," Holmes explained, handing a cup to Watson. "Their contents, or rather, what specifically was taken from them, may provide insight into the broader objectives of our mysterious H. Meanwhile, I would ask you to visit St. Bartholomew's Hospital and examine the guards who survived the freezing. Their condition may yield valuable medical data about the weapon's effects and, potentially, how to counteract them." "A sensible division," Watson agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Though I confess I'm concerned about your safety, Holmes. If this H is monitoring your involvement in the case, he may take steps to remove you as an obstacle." A thin smile crossed Holmes's face. "Your concern is appreciated, my dear Watson, but I assure you I shall exercise appropriate caution. Besides," he added with characteristic confidence, "our adversary has likely not anticipated how much we've already deduced about his operation." After a hasty breakfast and necessary ablutions, the 2 friends parted ways on Baker Street, each bound for his assigned investigation. Holmes hailed a cab to return to the Bank of England, while Watson set off towards St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where the unfortunate guards were being treated. Holmes found the bank in a state of controlled chaos. Despite the early hour, officials from the Treasury had already arrived, conferring urgently with bank executives in the imposing entrance hall. Inspector Lestrade was still on site, looking as though he too had passed a sleepless night, his usually neat appearance somewhat dishevelled. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he greeted the detective with visible relief. "I was about to send for you. We've completed the inventory of the affected safety deposit boxes, and the results are puzzling, to say the least." "I anticipated as much, Inspector," Holmes replied. "Shall we examine them directly?" Lestrade led Holmes back to the vault area, which now bore little resemblance to the frozen scene of the previous evening. The ice had melted completely, leaving puddles on the marble floor that bank employees were diligently mopping up. The massive vault door hung open, its shattered locking mechanism a testament to the extraordinary method of entry. Inside, the vault appeared largely undisturbed, with rows of safety deposit boxes lining the walls, their brass facades gleaming in the electric lighting recently installed by the forward-thinking bank. Only one section showed signs of disturbance, a cluster of 5 boxes with their doors hanging open, the contents removed. "Here we are, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, gesturing to the violated boxes. According to the bank's records, these 5 boxes belonged to individuals with no apparent connection to one another. A retired military officer, a professor of engineering at Imperial College, a shipping merchant, a widow of considerable means, and a representative of a German industrial concern. Holmes examined the empty boxes carefully, noting the lack of damage to their locks. They were opened with keys, not forced, he observed, suggesting our perpetrators either possessed duplicate keys or compelled the box holders to provide them. "Have you interviewed the owners?" "We've reached 4 of them so far," Lestrade replied, consulting his notebook. "All report that their keys are missing, apparently stolen from their homes or offices within the past week. None realized the thefts until our inquiries brought the matter to their attention. The keys were taken with remarkable subtlety, it seems." "And the contents of the boxes? What was taken?" Lestrade's expression grew more troubled. "That's the peculiar part, Mr. Holmes. According to the owners, each box contained documents rather than valuables, patents, research notes, technical specifications. The widow, Lady Asherton, is perhaps the most puzzling. Her box contained her late husband's research on refrigeration techniques. He was something of an amateur scientist, it seems." Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest. "Not money or jewellery, but technical knowledge. Precisely as I suspected, Inspector. Our perpetrator is collecting scientific information related to his freezing technology, perhaps to refine it further, or to eliminate potential competing approaches." "But why go to such elaborate lengths?" Lestrade wondered. "The frozen guards, the shattered vault door. It seems unnecessarily theatrical if documents were the only objective." "Because the theft was secondary to the demonstration," Holmes explained, his voice lowering as bank employees passed nearby. "Consider, Inspector, what more dramatic way to showcase a new weapons capability than to breach the supposedly impregnable Bank of England? Every government and criminal organization in Europe will have heard of this incident by now, and the more perceptive among them will recognize the implications." Lestrade paled slightly as understanding dawned. "You believe this was an advertisement?" "Of sorts, yes. A practical demonstration for potential buyers." Holmes circled the vault slowly, his keen eyes taking in details others might miss. "Tell me, was anything left behind? Any signature or message from the perpetrators?" The inspector hesitated before answering. "There was one thing, though I'm not certain of its significance. A small card, left in one of the empty boxes." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a white calling card, handling it carefully by the edges. Holmes accepted it, examining it closely. The card was blank, except for a single embossed symbol in its center, the now familiar snowflake design within a perfect circle. "The same mark as on the crate in Finch's room," Holmes murmured. "Our perpetrator is growing bolder, Inspector, claiming credit for his demonstration openly. But to what end, Mr. Holmes? What is the ultimate purpose behind these freezing attacks?" Holmes returned the card to Lestrade. "I believe we're witnessing the emergence of a new kind of criminal enterprise, one that merges scientific brilliance with commercial ambition. This H has acquired a revolutionary technology, eliminated its inventor, and is now advertising its capabilities to potential buyers. The ultimate goal, I suspect, is to auction this weapon to the highest bidder, be they government or criminal organization. Good Lord, Lestrade muttered. The implications are frightening. Indeed they are, Inspector, which is why we must move quickly to identify and apprehend this individual before the auction can take place. Holmes turned toward the vault entrance. I would like to examine the exterior of the building, particularly any alleyways or service entrances. The freezing apparatus, however miniaturized, must still require some means of delivery and operation. Perhaps they left traces we can follow. Outside the bank, Holmes conducted a methodical examination of the surrounding area, paying particular attention to alleyways that offered access to the building's less visible entrances. In a narrow passage behind the bank, used primarily for coal deliveries, he discovered what he was seeking. Subtle scuff marks on the cobblestones, where something heavy had been positioned, and a fine crystalline residue in the mortar between bricks at approximately waist height. Using a small magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers from his coat pocket, Holmes collected samples of the residue in a glass vial, his expression intensifying as he examined it more closely. "Just as I suspected," he murmured to himself. "The same compound found in Finch's room, though in much smaller quantities. They positioned their apparatus here, directed the freezing agent through this ventilation grating, and allowed it to spread through the bank's air circulation system." He straightened, pocketing the sample vial, and made his way back to the main entrance where Lestrade awaited him. "I believe I've found the point of delivery for the freezing agent, Inspector," Holmes reported. "A clever approach, utilizing the bank's own ventilation system to distribute the gas evenly throughout the vault area. It suggests considerable planning and, more concerning, a detailed knowledge of the bank's architecture." An inside job, you think? Not necessarily, though I wouldn't rule it out. Building plans can be acquired through various means, by those with sufficient determination. Holmes checked his pocket watch. "I should meet Watson at St. Bartholomew's to compare our findings. Meanwhile, Inspector, I suggest you place discreet surveillance on the owners of the targeted safety deposit boxes. If our perpetrators require their technical documents, they may seek direct contact with the originators of that research." With that, Holmes departed, hailing a cab to take him to the hospital where Watson was examining the frozen guards. His mind worked furiously during the journey, assembling the disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative. The pattern was becoming clearer, a calculated sequence of events designed to acquire, perfect, and ultimately profit from Finch's revolutionary technology. At St. Bartholomew's, Holmes found Watson in conversation with the chief physician in a private consultation room, both men looking grave. "Ah, Holmes," Watson greeted him. "I was just discussing the guard's condition with Dr. Trevelyan. The prognosis is uncertain, I'm afraid." Dr. Trevelyan, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, nodded in confirmation. "Most unusual case, Mr. Holmes. The men were in a state of profound hypothermia when brought in, with core body temperatures well below what is typically survivable. Yet the freezing appears to have occurred so rapidly that the usual cellular damage associated with freezing injuries is minimal. Similar to Finch's condition, though less advanced," Holmes noted. "They were fortunate to be discovered before the process was completed." Indeed, Watson agreed. We've managed to elevate their body temperatures gradually, but they remain unconscious. The most concerning aspect is the presence of an unidentified compound in their bloodstream, similar to what was found in Finch's tissues, but in an active rather than frozen state. Holmes's expression sharpened with interest. You've isolated the compound? In small quantities, yes, Dr. Trevelyan confirmed. It appears to be a modified nitrogen-based substance with extraordinary heat absorption properties. We're at a loss to explain its exact mechanism of action, though its effects are clear enough. May I see the patients? Holmes requested. The doctor led them to a private ward where 2 men lay in hospital beds, attended by nurses who monitored their condition closely. Both remained unconscious, their complexions waxy and pale, with a faint bluish tinge to their lips, despite the warm blankets piled upon them and the braziers heating the room to an almost uncomfortable degree. Holmes observed them carefully, noting the lingering effects of their encounter with the freezing technology. How long before they regain consciousness, Doctor? Dr. Trevelyan spread his hands in a gesture of medical uncertainty. Impossible to say with confidence, Mr. Holmes. This is entirely outside our experience. If their condition follows the pattern of severe hypothermia cases, they might awaken within days. Or they might never recover fully. The brain can only withstand so much trauma from extreme temperature reduction. And if they do awaken, Holmes pressed, will they be able to identify their attackers? Doubtful, Watson interjected. Based on the evidence from the bank and Finch's case, the freezing agent acts with such speed that victims would have little time to register what was happening, let alone identify perpetrators. More likely, they would recall only a sudden, overwhelming cold before losing consciousness. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze still fixed on the unfortunate guards. Nevertheless, they are our only living witnesses to the technology's deployment. If they regain consciousness, Watson, I trust you'll inform me immediately. Of course, Holmes, Watson assured him. I've arranged to be notified of any change in their condition. As they departed the hospital ward, Holmes shared what he had discovered at the bank. The targeted theft of technical documents, the calling card left behind, and the traces of the freezing compound found outside the building. It seems our adversary is both collecting related research and advertising his technology's capabilities, Watson observed as they descended the hospital steps. A concerning combination. Indeed, Holmes agreed grimly, and we must assume he is preparing for the next stage of his plan, likely a more dramatic demonstration, or possibly the auction itself. But how do we identify him, Holmes? This H has managed to operate with remarkable anonymity thus far. Holmes paused on the bottom step, his expression resolute. By following the scientific thread, Watson, Finch's research didn't exist in isolation. There would be suppliers, collaborators, competitors. The documents stolen from the safety deposit boxes provide another vector of investigation. He raised his hand to hail a passing cab. To the Imperial College of Science, my friend. The professor whose safety deposit box was targeted may provide the connection we need. The Imperial College of Science stood as a monument to mankind's pursuit of knowledge, its neo-Gothic architecture housing laboratories where the boundaries of understanding were constantly expanded. As Holmes and Watson approached the imposing entrance, the winter afternoon was already deepening toward dusk, the short December day surrendering to darkness despite the early hour. Professor Gilbert Ainsworth, Holmes informed Watson as they climbed the stone steps. The engineering professor whose safety deposit box was targeted. According to Lestrade's notes, he specializes in thermodynamic applications for industrial machinery, a field tangentially related to our freezing technology. They were admitted to the college by a porter who, upon hearing Holmes's name, directed them immediately to the professor's laboratory in the east wing. The corridors echoed with their footsteps as they walked, most students having departed for the Christmas holiday, leaving the building in that peculiar state of academic limbo that precedes a seasonal break. Professor Ainsworth's laboratory was a high-ceilinged room filled with an assortment of mechanical apparatus, drafting tables, and glass-fronted cabinets containing models and components. The professor himself stood before one such cabinet, a slender man of late middle age, with a meticulously trimmed white beard, and the stooped posture of someone who has spent decades bent over workbenches and journals. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Ainsworth greeted them, turning at their entrance with an expression of mingled concern and intellectual curiosity. "Inspector Lestrade telegraphed that you might call. This business with my safety deposit box has been most disturbing." "Professor Ainsworth," Holmes acknowledged with a slight bow. "May I introduce my colleague, Dr. John Watson? We appreciate your willingness to speak with us about this matter." Of course. The professor gestured toward chairs arranged around a small table in the corner of the laboratory, clearly used for consultations with students. "Though I fear I've little to add beyond what I told the police. The documents stolen were merely patent applications for improvements to industrial refrigeration systems, valuable in a commercial sense, certainly, but hardly worth the extraordinary effort of breaking into the Bank of England." Holmes settled into one of the chairs, studying the professor with that penetrating gaze Watson knew so well, observing, deducing, assembling the invisible threads of connection. "Your modesty does you credit, Professor," Holmes said after a moment, "but I suspect your work may be more significant than you imply. These improvements, did they perchance involve methods of achieving unusually low temperatures through gas expansion?" Ainsworth's eyebrows rose slightly. "Why, yes. My research focuses on creating more efficient cooling mechanisms for industrial applications. My latest work explored a method of achieving temperatures approaching -80 degrees Celsius using a modified nitrogen compound under precisely controlled pressure conditions. Similar to the approach employed by Edwin Finch," Holmes noted, watching carefully for the professor's reaction. He was not disappointed. Ainsworth's expression shifted subtly, a momentary widening of the eyes, a slight tension around the mouth. "Finch? The name is vaguely familiar. A researcher at Oxford, if I recall correctly." "Among other affiliations," Holmes agreed smoothly, "including, perhaps, the Institute for Thermal Research." This time the professor's reaction was more pronounced. He glanced quickly toward the laboratory door, as if ensuring they remained private, before leaning forward with a lowered voice. "You are remarkably well informed, Mr. Holmes." "Yes, I knew of Finch's work through the Institute, though we never collaborated directly. I received word of his death yesterday. A laboratory accident, I was told." "Not an accident, Professor," Holmes corrected grimly. "Murder, using the very technology he had developed. A technology remarkably similar to your own research, it seems." Ainsworth paled visibly. "Murder. Good heavens, I had no idea." He removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of distress. "Though I confess I had concerns about the Institute's direction in recent months." "Please elaborate," Holmes prompted, his voice gentle but insistent. The professor replaced his spectacles, glancing again toward the door. The institute began as a legitimate research collective, privately funded, but with genuine scientific objectives, exploring extreme refrigeration techniques primarily for medical and industrial applications, organ preservation, food storage, specialized manufacturing processes, all perfectly legitimate areas of inquiry. But something changed, Watson suggested, noting the professor's evident unease. Indeed, Dr. Watson, about 6 months ago, the Institute's focus shifted. New funding appeared, along with new directives. Our research parameters were narrowed to focus specifically on achieving the most extreme temperature reductions possible, with particular emphasis on rapid deployment methods. Ainsworth shook his head. Several of us expressed concerns about potential weaponization, but we were assured the applications remained benign. These new directives, Holmes interjected, were they accompanied by new leadership? Yes, Ainsworth confirmed. A new research director was appointed, a brilliant scientist with connections to both government and industry. He never used his full name, introducing himself simply as Professor H. Most assumed it was an academic affectation. Holmes and Watson exchanged meaningful glances. "Can you describe him?" Holmes asked. "Tall, austere, with penetrating eyes and a scholarly demeanor. He spoke with precision and authority, clearly a man accustomed to command." The professor hesitated. There was something unsettling about him, a coldness that had nothing to do with our research subject. Many found reasons to terminate their association with the Institute after his arrival. "But not you," Holmes observed. Ainsworth looked down, a flicker of shame crossing his features. "My research funding from traditional sources has been cut. The Institute offered generous support and state-of-the-art facilities. I told myself I was only pursuing pure science, that applications were someone else's concern." He sighed heavily. A convenient ethical evasion, in retrospect. "Did you ever meet a young researcher named Chambers?" Watson inquired. "Perhaps working closely with Finch?" "Edward Chambers, yes." The professor nodded. "Brilliant young man, specialized in catalyst chemistry. He worked primarily with Finch on the gas delivery mechanisms. He seemed increasingly troubled in our last few meetings, asking pointed questions about the Institute's governance and funding sources." Holmes leaned forward intently. "Professor Ainsworth, do you know where we might find Chambers? His testimony could be crucial to our investigation." "I'm afraid not. He stopped attending Institute gatherings about a month ago. Rumor had it he'd taken a position abroad, though that seemed rather sudden." Ainsworth paused, considering. "He did mention a private laboratory he maintained in Limehouse, near the docks. Said the ventilation was better suited to his catalyst experiments." "Limehouse?" Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "A district with many secrets and few questions asked. An ideal location for someone wishing to continue research away from prying eyes." The professor's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Mr. Holmes, if the Institute's research has indeed been weaponized as you suggest, the implications are deeply disturbing. The temperatures we achieved in controlled laboratory conditions could, in theory, freeze a human being solid in seconds if properly deployed. The compounds involved are colorless, odorless, and leave minimal trace evidence once they dissipate." "The perfect murder weapon," Watson murmured, "or the perfect tool for breaking into secure locations by rendering metal brittle enough to shatter." "Exactly so," Ainsworth agreed. And there's more. In the weeks before my research notes were stolen, Professor H had been discussing a new delivery mechanism, one that could be miniaturized and deployed remotely without requiring the operator's presence. Holmes's expression sharpened. A weapon that could be planted in advance and triggered from a distance? Precisely. The technical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable, if he solved them. The professor let the sentence hang, the implications clear to all present. "One final question, Professor," Holmes said after a momentary silence. "This Institute for Thermal Research, where are its facilities located?" "That's the peculiar thing," Ainsworth replied. "It has no permanent location. Meetings and experiments were conducted in different facilities each time. Sometimes university laboratories after hours, sometimes private research spaces. Professor H was adamant about maintaining what he called operational security." Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed a theory already forming in his mind. "Thank you, Professor. You've been most helpful." He rose from his chair, Watson following suit. "I would advise extreme caution in the coming days. If your research notes were valuable enough to steal, your personal knowledge may be equally coveted." The professor's face paled further. "You believe I might be in danger?" "It's a possibility we cannot discount," Holmes replied gravely. "Perhaps a brief holiday away from London would be prudent, at least until this matter is resolved." As they departed the Imperial College, darkness had fallen completely, the gas lamps casting pools of yellow light across the frost-rimed pavement. Their breath-formed clouds in the cold air as Holmes hailed a passing cab. "Limehouse, Watson," he instructed as they climbed aboard. "We must locate Chambers' laboratory. He may be the key to identifying our mysterious Professor H, and perhaps to understanding the next target in this freezing campaign." The cab rattled through London's streets, the comfortable neighbourhoods surrounding the Imperial College, gradually giving way to narrower, less well-maintained thoroughfares as they approached the docklands. Limehouse was a district of contradictions, respectable businesses operating alongside establishments of questionable legality, the air heavy with the mingled scents of the Thames, exotic spices from the nearby warehouses, and the less savoury odours of a densely populated area with inadequate sanitation. "What do you make of Ainsworth's information, Holmes?" Watson asked as they journeyed. "Do you believe that Professor H is preparing to sell his freezing weapon to the highest bidder?" "It appears increasingly likely," Holmes replied, gazing thoughtfully out the cab window at the passing streets. The Bank of England incident bears all the hallmarks of a demonstration for potential buyers. A technology that can breach the most secure vault in London would command an extraordinary price from certain quarters. But surely such a transaction couldn't occur undetected. The deployment of the weapon at the bank has already attracted considerable attention from the authorities, which suggests our adversary is operating on an accelerated timeline, Holmes reasoned. He knows an official investigation will eventually identify him, so he must complete his auction and disappear before that occurs. He turned from the window, fixing Watson with an intense gaze. "I suspect, my friend, that we have very little time to prevent this weapon from passing into the hands of those who would use it for truly catastrophic purposes." The cab slowed as they entered the narrow streets of Limehouse proper, where the buildings pressed close together and the gas lamps were spaced farther apart, creating pools of shadow between islands of light. Holmes directed the driver toward the area nearest the docks, where warehouses and workshops clustered along the riverside. "How do you propose to find Chambers' laboratory?" Watson inquired practically. "Limehouse contains countless small workshops and private laboratories." "By applying deductive reasoning to our specific requirements," Holmes replied. "Chambers works with volatile chemicals requiring excellent ventilation. His research involves extreme cold, necessitating robust power supply and possibly water access for cooling systems. And given the sensitive nature of his work, he would select a location offering privacy and minimal neighboring occupancy." Holmes leaned out the window, studying the buildings they passed, until he spotted a narrow side street, lined with small industrial structures. "Stop here," he instructed the driver, already reaching for the door handle. The alley Holmes had identified contained several workshops, most dark and shuttered for the night. One building, however, showed a faint light seeping around the edges of heavily curtained windows. A 3-story brick structure with a loading door facing the alley, and a chimney from which a thin plume of smoke rose into the night sky. "Note the modifications, Watson," Holmes murmured as they approached cautiously. "Extra ventilation grates installed in the upper story, recent reinforcement of the door frame, and a private electrical generator alongside the building. All consistent with specialized laboratory requirements." They approached the front entrance, a sturdy door with no identifying marks or business name. Holmes examined it carefully before attempting to knock, noting the modern lock mechanism and the slight frosting around the doorframe, nearly invisible in the dim light, but telling to his experienced eye. "Be prepared for anything, Watson," he cautioned, reaching into his coat pocket where, Watson knew, he kept a small revolver for dangerous situations. If Chambers is indeed continuing Finch's research, he may be understandably paranoid about unexpected visitors. Holmes knocked firmly on the door, 3 measured raps that echoed in the quiet alley. No immediate response came, though Watson thought he detected a slight movement behind one of the curtained windows above. "Mr. Chambers," Holmes called, pitching his voice to carry without shouting. "Edward Chambers, we are here about Edwin Finch and the Institute for Thermal Research. Your safety may be in jeopardy." A long moment passed before they heard approaching footsteps within. The door opened a crack, restrained by a heavy chain, revealing a portion of a young man's face, pale, with wire-rimmed spectacles and suspicious eyes. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice tense with evident fear. "Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We're investigating Finch's murder and the theft at the Bank of England, both connected to the freezing technology you helped develop." The door closed abruptly, followed by the sound of the chain being removed, before opening again, fully, to admit them. Edward Chambers was a slender man of perhaps 28, with the intense, slightly dishevelled appearance of a researcher too absorbed in his work to attend to personal details. His laboratory coat bore chemical stains of various colours, and his fingers showed the calluses and minor burns typical of someone who worked regularly with experimental apparatus. "Come in quickly," he urged, glancing nervously up and down the alley before securing the door behind them. "I've been expecting someone to find me, though I hoped it would be the authorities rather than Professor Hawthorne's people." "Hawthorne?" Holmes repeated, seizing on the name immediately. "Professor H." "Yes," Chambers confirmed, leading them through a small anteroom into the main laboratory space beyond. Professor James Hawthorne, formerly of Cambridge University, until a scandal involving military research led to his quiet dismissal. Now he operates in the shadows between legitimate science and weaponry development, selling his expertise to the highest bidder. The laboratory itself was impressively equipped, with multiple workbenches supporting complex apparatus of glass, copper, and brass. One corner contained what appeared to be a scaled-down version of the device they had discovered in Finch's room. The modified pressure cooker, with its array of valves and tubes, connected to several gas canisters secured in metal brackets against the wall. "You've continued Finch's research?" Holmes observed, gesturing toward the apparatus. Chambers nodded, removing his spectacles to clean them nervously on his coat sleeve. "Not to weaponize it, but to understand it fully, and to develop potential countermeasures. I believe the technology still has legitimate medical applications, despite how Hawthorne has perverted its purpose." "You knew Finch had been murdered using his own invention?" Watson asked. "I suspected as much when I heard of his death," Chambers replied grimly. "I warned him that Hawthorne had grown impatient with his reluctance to demonstrate the technology's full potential, as he put it. That's why I established this laboratory, to continue our work away from the Institute's oversight." He replaced his spectacles, blinking rapidly. "When I learned of the Bank of England incident, I knew Hawthorne had successfully weaponized the freezing compound and was preparing for the final stage of his plan." "The auction?" Holmes stated, rather than asked. "Precisely, Mr. Holmes." Chambers moved to a cluttered desk, retrieving a folded paper which he handed to the detective. "This circulated among select parties 3 days ago. I maintain contacts within certain scientific circles who passed it to me, knowing my connection to the underlying technology." Holmes unfolded the paper, Watson leaning close to read alongside him. It was a formal invitation, elegantly printed on heavy stock, bearing the now familiar snowflake symbol at its head. "Distinguished Gentlemen of Enterprise and Vision, you are cordially invited to a private demonstration and auction of a revolutionary security technology that renders all existing protective measures obsolete. The recent incident at the Bank of England serves as merely one example of its capabilities. The gathering will commence at 9 o'clock in the evening, December 12th, at the address provided to your designated representative upon confirmation of attendance. Initial bids begin at $100,000, proof of funds required. The future of power awaits those bold enough to seize it." The invitation was unsigned, bearing only the snowflake emblem as signature. "December 12th, Watson noted with alarm. "That's tomorrow night." "We have very little time," Holmes agreed, carefully refolding the invitation. "Mr. Chambers, what can you tell us about this auction? Do you know where it might be held?" The grey light of dawn was filtering through the windows of 221B Baker Street as Holmes and Watson finalized their preparations. Neither man had slept, the urgency of the situation demanding continuous action throughout the night. The sitting room bore evidence of their labours. Maps of London spread across every surface, telegrams stacked on the side table, and the chemistry apparatus Holmes had used to analyse Chambers' samples still arranged on the desk. "Hawthorne has chosen his location well," Holmes observed, studying a large map of the Docklands area with a magnifying glass. "The abandoned cold storage warehouse at Butler's Wharf offers multiple tactical advantages. Isolated position, thick walls designed to maintain low temperatures, and proximity to the river for quick escape if necessary." Watson nodded, checking his medical bag for the final time. At Holmes's insistence, he had packed not only his usual instruments, but also several special preparations they had developed based on Chambers' insights into the freezing technology. Chambers believes his neutralizing compound will work? Watson asked, carefully wrapping glass vials in cotton padding to prevent breakage. In laboratory conditions, it proved effective in halting the cascade reaction of the freezing agent, Holmes replied. Whether it will perform equally well in field conditions remains to be seen. But it represents our best defense should Hawthorne deploy his weapon during the confrontation. The previous night had been a whirlwind of activity following their meeting with Edward Chambers. The young scientist had shared everything he knew about Hawthorne's operation, the modified freezing compound, the auction preparations, and crucially, intelligence about the likely venue, gathered from a contact who had received the invitation. Most valuable of all had been Chambers' work on a neutralizing agent, a chemical compound designed to interrupt the molecular chain reaction that produced the extreme cold. Under Holmes's direction, they had spent hours in the Limehouse laboratory refining and testing this countermeasure, producing enough to equip themselves and the select group of trusted police officers Holmes had arranged to participate in the raid. Lestrade should have received my instructions by now, Holmes noted, glancing at the mantel clock. His men will take positions surrounding the warehouse by late afternoon, well before any auction attendees arrive. And our role? Watson inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the controlled excitement Watson had observed so many times before dangerous confrontations. We shall enter ahead of the police, my friend. I must confirm Hawthorne's presence and the location of the freezing apparatus before the raid commences. A frontal police assault without this intelligence could result in disaster. Either the deployment of the weapon against the officers or its destruction before we can secure it. Watson sighed, recognizing the necessity, but disliking the risk. I suppose it's too much to hope that you might consider allowing Lestrade's men to handle this entirely. A small smile touched Holmes's lips. Come now, Watson. Would you truly be content to await the outcome from a safe distance? You know perfectly well I would not, Watson admitted with a rueful shake of his head. Though I maintain that one of these days your penchant for personal involvement will lead to consequences more serious than we've yet encountered. Perhaps, Holmes conceded, but not today, I think. Today we shall put an end to Professor Hawthorne's freezing death before it can be unleashed upon the world at large. Their preparation continued throughout the morning, with Holmes dispatching telegrams to various contacts, and Watson reviewing Chambers' notes on the medical aspects of extreme cold exposure. By early afternoon they were ready to depart, their plan established, and equipment prepared. As they donned their coats, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a tray of sandwiches and hot tea. You gentlemen haven't eaten since yesterday, she chided gently. Whatever crisis London faces today, it won't be helped by you facing it on empty stomachs. Holmes accepted the offered sustenance with uncharacteristic compliance, recognizing the wisdom in fortifying themselves before the confrontation ahead. Your concern is appreciated, Mrs. Hudson. Dr. Watson and I may be late returning this evening, or perhaps early tomorrow. Please don't bother yourself to wait. Their landlady's expression suggested she was well accustomed to such statements. I shall keep something warm for your return, "Whenever that may be," she replied simply, with the resigned patience of someone who had long ago accepted the irregular habits of her lodgers. The journey to Butler's Wharf took them through progressively less affluent areas of London, until they reached the commercial docklands, where massive warehouses lined the Thames, serving the shipping trade that remained the lifeblood of the empire. The day had remained overcast, an early dusk, already settling over the city as their cab deposited them several streets away from their destination, close enough for convenience, but distant enough to avoid notice. "We'll approach on foot from here," Holmes instructed, paying the driver. "Observe the warehouse first, from multiple angles, before attempting entry." They walked in silence through the narrow streets, the sounds of commerce diminishing as they moved deeper into an area where many warehouses stood empty or underutilized, casualties of changing trade patterns and economic fluctuations. Butler's Wharf loomed ahead, a substantial brick structure with few windows and heavy loading doors facing both the street and riversides. "There," Holmes murmured, indicating a smaller door on the building's eastern flank, partially obscured by stacked crates. "The service entrance, likely our best point of ingress." They circled the warehouse carefully, noting points of possible surveillance and escape routes. Despite the building's apparently abandoned state, Holmes detected subtle signs of recent activity. Fresh wheel marks in the mud near the loading dock, a newly installed padlock on the service door, and most tellingly, the faint hum of electrical generators emanating from within. "The auction preparations are well advanced," he observed, as they concealed themselves behind a stack of empty crates to observe the main entrance. "Note the discrete electrical wiring running from that junction box to the warehouse, recently installed and of considerably higher capacity than this building would normally require." "For the freezing apparatus?" Watson suggested. "Precisely. Hawthorne's technology requires significant power to compress the gases to the necessary pressures. He would need reliable electricity, independent of London's sometimes unreliable grid." Holmes checked his pocket watch. Nearly 5 o'clock. Lestrade's men should be taking their positions now. As if on cue, they glimpsed the subtle movement of plainclothes officers establishing a perimeter at discreet distances from the warehouse, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough to avoid detection by Hawthorne's people. "We should move now, before the auction attendees begin to arrive," Holmes decided, leading Watson toward the service entrance they had identified earlier. The padlock presented little challenge to Holmes's lock-picking skills, and within minutes they had slipped inside, finding themselves in a narrow corridor lined with abandoned offices. The air held a peculiar quality, not the musty dampness typical of disused buildings near the river, but an artificial dryness, with a faint metallic undertone that Watson recognized from their previous encounters with the freezing technology. "They've been testing the apparatus here," he whispered, noting how his breath did not condense despite the December chill. Holmes nodded in agreement, moving forward with practiced stealth. They advanced slowly through the corridor, pausing at each intersection to listen for signs of occupation. As they neared the central storage area, voices became audible, efficient, business-like tones discussing technical matters beyond Watson's understanding, but clearly familiar to Holmes, whose expression intensified with each overheard fragment. "They're calibrating the demonstration unit," he breathed close to Watson's ear. "Final preparations for tonight's display." They reached a door leading to the main warehouse floor, left slightly ajar to permit the passage of electrical cables. Through this narrow opening they gained their first view of Hawthorne's operation. The cavernous space had been transformed into a macabre auction house. A semicircle of chairs faced a raised platform where a large object stood, covered by a black cloth. Men in laboratory coats moved purposefully around this central feature, adjusting gauges and connecting tubes to gleaming metal canisters. Along one wall, a row of gas cylinders stood in the metal brackets, each bearing the now familiar snowflake symbol. And there, directing the activity with precise gestures and clipped commands, stood a tall figure Watson immediately recognized from descriptions as Professor James Hawthorne. Even at this distance, the man emanated authority and cold intelligence, his austere features set in an expression of scientific detachment, as he inspected a component handed to him by one of his assistants. 5 men total, Holmes whispered, after careful observation. Hawthorne and 4 assistants, all armed, note the bulges beneath their laboratory coats. The covered object on the platform must be the demonstration unit for tonight's auction. Similar to what we found in Finch's room, Watson asked. A more sophisticated version, I suspect. Designed to showcase the technology's potential to prospective buyers in a controlled environment. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied the arrangement. See how the chairs are positioned at a specific distance from the platform? They've calculated the precise radius within which the freezing effect will be demonstrated, while leaving the audience safely outside its range. They withdrew slightly from the door to confer without risk of detection. We should signal Lestrade now, Watson suggested. His men could storm the warehouse before the auction begins. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. The demonstration unit concerns me. If it's triggered during a police raid, the consequences could be catastrophic. We must disable it first, or at minimum, understand its triggering mechanism to prevent accidental activation. And how do you propose to accomplish that, with 5 armed men in attendance? Watson asked, skeptically. A thin smile crossed Holmes's face. Through an appropriate disguise and the element of surprise, my friend. From his coat pocket, Holmes produced 2 small cards identical to the invitation they had seen in Chambers' laboratory, complete with the snowflake emblem. Courtesy of a telegraph contact at the Grand Hotel, where several auction attendees are staying. These should gain us admission when the time comes. Holmes, surely you don't intend to attend the auction openly? Indeed I do, Watson, with you as my technical advisor. Holmes reached into his other pocket, withdrawing 2 small vials of clear liquid. Chambers' neutralizing compound. Each of us will carry 1. Our insurance against Hawthorne's technology, should it be deployed in our direction. Watson accepted the vial reluctantly, securing it in his waistcoat pocket. A dangerous gambit, Holmes. But a necessary one. Observe the electrical connections to that demonstration unit. They're routed through a central control panel beside Hawthorne's position, likely including remote activation capability. We must identify and neutralize that system before signaling Lestrade, or risk a freezing blast targeted at the police as they enter. Recognizing the logic despite his reservations, Watson nodded. What's our approach? We withdraw now and return at 8:30, presenting ourselves as legitimate auction attendees, foreign buyers, I think, to explain any slight awkwardness in our manner. Once inside, we separate subtly. I'll work my way toward the control panel, while you position yourself to administer the neutralizing compound to the demonstration unit if necessary." The plan established, they retreated carefully from the warehouse, emerging into the gathering darkness without detection. The winter evening had turned bitterly cold, a cruel irony given the nature of their quarry, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the dockyard with white. "We should update Lestrade," Watson suggested, as they made their way to a small tavern several streets distant, where they could warm themselves and make final preparations. "Already arranged," Holmes replied. "One of his plainclothes men will meet us here. I anticipated the need to adjust our timeline after reconnaissance." In the tavern, a humble establishment catering to dock workers and sailors, they secured a corner table away from other patrons. The warmth of the room and the hearty stew provided by the proprietor helped restore their energy after the tense infiltration. As they ate, a nondescript man in a fisherman's jacket entered, ordered ale at the bar, and eventually made his way to their table. Constable Parker, one of Lestrade's most trusted officers, skilled in undercover work. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted them quietly, sliding onto the bench opposite. "Inspector Lestrade awaits your report." Holmes quickly outlined what they had observed, emphasizing the dangers posed by the demonstration unit and the need to disable it before the main police assault. "We shall enter as auction attendees at 8:30. Once inside, I'll signal when the technical threat has been neutralized. The raid should commence precisely at 9:15, late enough for most attendees to have arrived. But before the demonstration begins." Parker nodded, committing the details to memory. "Inspector Lestrade has 20 men positioned around the warehouse, with more in reserve nearby. All entrances are under observation." "Excellent. Remind him that his men must be equipped with the neutralizing compound as instructed. If the freezing technology is deployed, conventional police tactics will prove futile, possibly fatal." Holmes passed a final vial across the table. "For the inspector himself. Direct application to any frozen surface will initiate a chemical reaction that halts the freezing process." As Parker departed to relay these instructions, Watson checked his watch. "Nearly 7:30. Time to prepare our disguises, I think." From a small valise Holmes had brought with them, they extracted the elements needed to transform themselves into plausible auction attendees, subtle alterations to their appearance that would prevent immediate recognition while allowing natural movement. For Holmes, a neatly trimmed false beard and tinted spectacles changed his distinctive profile, while Watson adopted a monocle and carefully applied theatrical makeup to suggest a dueling scar along his left cheek. "German arms dealers, I think," Holmes decided as they made their final adjustments. "Recently arrived in London and eager to acquire new military technology. The accent will come naturally to you, Watson, given your university studies in Vienna." By 8:15, they were approaching Butler's Wharf once more, now observing increased activity around the main entrance. Expensive carriages deposited well-dressed gentlemen who were admitted after presenting invitations identical to those Holmes carried. A pair of burly attendants flanked the door, scrutinizing each arrival carefully. "Remember," Holmes murmured as they neared the entrance, "we are Herr Kruger and Dr. Hoffman of the Hamburg Military Consortium. Interested but cautious buyers, technically knowledgeable, but not experts in this specific field." Watson nodded, straightening his posture to suggest the military bearing appropriate to their cover identities. "After you, Herr Kruger." They approached the entrance with measured confidence, Holmes, presenting their invitations with a slight German accent. Guten Abend. We represent the Hamburg interests. The guards examined their invitations, comparing them to a list before nodding and stepping aside. Through the main door, gentlemen. The demonstration begins at 9:30. Inside, the warehouse had been further transformed since their earlier reconnaissance. Elegant refreshment tables now flanked the semicircle of chairs, attended by servers in formal attire, a surreal touch of luxury amid the industrial setting. Approximately a dozen men already circulated in the space, conversing quietly in small groups, representing various nationalities, judging by the fragments of conversation Watson overheard. The demonstration unit remained covered on its platform, though now additional equipment had been arranged around it: pressure gauges, control panels, and most ominously, a small metal cage containing a live rabbit, positioned at what Holmes had identified as the calculated freezing radius. An animal test subject, Watson noted with distaste, to prove the technology's effectiveness. And to heighten the drama for potential buyers, Holmes agreed grimly. Observe Hawthorne by the control panel. He's the conductor of this macabre orchestra. Professor Hawthorne stood beside the central control system, immaculate in formal evening wear rather than the laboratory coat they had seen earlier. Up close, his features were even more striking. Hawkish nose, penetrating grey eyes, and a high forehead suggesting significant intellectual capacity. He surveyed the gathering with the calculated interest of an auctioneer assessing the wealth of his bidders. "We should separate now," Holmes murmured. "I'll approach Hawthorne directly. Scientific curiosity will be expected from potential buyers. Position yourself near that junction box to the left of the platform. If necessary, the neutralizing compound should be applied directly to the main gas line." Watson moved away casually, accepting a champagne flute from a passing server to enhance his cover as he worked his way toward the position Holmes had indicated. From this vantage point, he could observe both Holmes's interaction with Hawthorne and the demonstration apparatus itself, while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Holmes, meanwhile, had adopted the persona of the interested German industrialist completely, engaging one of Hawthorne's assistants in technical conversation that soon attracted the attention of the professor himself. Watson watched as Hawthorne turned to assess this new potential buyer, his expression revealing nothing beyond professional interest as Holmes was introduced. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness as more attendees arrived, and the warehouse filled with the quiet murmur of conversation. Watson recognized several faces among the gathered men: a Russian military attaché, an American industrialist rumored to have government contracts, and most concerningly, a notorious arms dealer whose products had appeared in conflicts across 3 continents. At precisely 9:20, 5 minutes after the agreed signal time, Holmes managed to position himself directly beside the main control panel, engaged in what appeared to be a fascinating conversation with Hawthorne himself. With a movement so subtle it would be invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it, Holmes extracted a small device from his pocket and pressed it against the underside of the control panel, the signal transmitter that would alert Lestrade's men to begin their raid. Watson tensed, readying himself for action as he calculated the seconds until the police would burst through the doors. His hand closed around the vial of neutralizing compound in his pocket, prepared to dash forward and disable the freezing apparatus if Hawthorne attempted to activate it during the confusion. 3 minutes passed, then 5, with no sign of police intervention. Something had gone wrong with the signal. Watson caught Holmes's eye across the room, noting the subtle tightening of his friend's expression that indicated he too had realized the plan had gone awry. And then, with terrible timing, Hawthorne stepped onto the platform and raised his hands for silence. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the now quiet warehouse, "I welcome you to this exclusive demonstration of a technology that will revolutionize security, warfare, and power dynamics across the globe. What you're about to witness represents the pinnacle of modern scientific achievement, the ability to generate extreme cold instantly, rendering any target immobile, any barrier brittle, any defense obsolete." With theatrical flourish, he pulled away the black cloth covering the demonstration unit, revealing an elegant brass and copper apparatus connected to the gas cylinders along the wall. At its center stood a glass chamber with various gauges and valves, directed toward the small cage containing the rabbit. "Tonight, you will observe a controlled demonstration on this small subject," Hawthorne continued. "Imagine the same effect applied to bank vaults, military installations, or indeed human targets of interest. The bidding will begin at £100,000, with increments of no less than 10,000. Watson saw Holmes begin to move, abandoning subtlety as he realized they could wait no longer for police intervention. At that moment, the main doors burst open, not with the coordinated entry of police officers, but with the panicked rush of Hawthorne's lookouts. "Police raid," one shouted. "Forces approaching from all sides." Chaos erupted instantly. The gathered buyers moved toward exits. Hawthorne's assistants drew weapons, and the professor himself lunged for the control panel with alarming speed. "No one will interfere with my work," he declared, fingers flying over the controls. "Perhaps a more dramatic demonstration is required, one that will dissuade further interruptions." Holmes launched himself toward Hawthorne, abandoning his disguise as he called out, "Watson, the apparatus." Watson needed no further instruction. As police whistles sounded outside and the first officers began to force entry through secondary doors, he dashed forward, extracting the vial of neutralizing compound. Hawthorne had already activated the demonstration unit, gauges spinning wildly as gas flowed through the copper tubing toward the central chamber. With precise movements born of medical training, Watson uncorked the vial and poured its contents directly into the input valve of the freezing apparatus. The effect was immediate. A violent hissing, followed by a plume of harmless vapor as the neutralizing compound interrupted the molecular reaction of the freezing agent. Simultaneously, Holmes grappled with Hawthorne at the control panel, the two men locked in desperate struggle, as the professor attempted to redirect the freezing effect toward the advancing police officers. Their confrontation knocked over equipment and sent control instruments clattering to the floor, but Holmes maintained his grip on Hawthorne's arms, preventing him from reaching the emergency triggers built into the system. "It's over, Hawthorne," Holmes declared, finally managing to force the professor away from the controls. "Your freezing death ends here." With a cry of rage, Hawthorne broke free and lunged for a small device in his pocket, a remote trigger that Holmes had identified earlier. Before he could activate it, however, Inspector Lestrade himself appeared behind him, service revolver raised. "Professor James Hawthorne," Lestrade announced with grim satisfaction. "You are under arrest for the murder of Edwin Finch, the robbery of the Bank of England, and conspiracy to sell illegal weapons technology." as police officers flooded the warehouse, securing Hawthorne's assistants and the few auction attendees too slow to escape. Watson rushed to Holmes's side, checking his friend for injuries from the struggle. "I'm quite all right, Watson," Holmes assured him, straightening his dishevelled clothing. "Though our timing was rather closer than I would have preferred. What delayed Lestrade's men?" "Electrical interference from Hawthorne's equipment," Lestrade explained, approaching, after handing Hawthorne into the custody of 2 burly constables. "Your signalling device was blocked until we moved to our contingency plan, though I see you managed admirably despite the delay." Watson gestured to the neutralized apparatus. "Thanks to Chambers' compound. Without it, I fear Hawthorne might have succeeded in deploying his weapon against your officers." Holmes surveyed the warehouse, now secured by police, with quiet satisfaction. "A most unusual case, Lestrade. I suggest your men exercise extreme caution in dismantling this equipment. The technology, while currently neutralized, remains dangerous in the wrong hands." "We'll have experts from the Royal Society supervise its decommissioning," Lestrade assured him. "And young Mr. Chambers has agreed to assist, in exchange for consideration regarding his own involvement." As police continued processing the scene, collecting evidence and securing the freezing technology for safe transport, Holmes and Watson stepped outside into the winter night. The snow had ceased, leaving London draped in a pristine white blanket that reflected the gas lamp's glow. "A fitting conclusion," Watson observed as they walked toward the main road to find transportation back to Baker Street. "The creator of artificial winter, apprehended on a winter's night." Holmes nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Though the natural cold seems almost gentle, by comparison, does it not? Hawthorne perverted science for power and profit, transforming a technology with beneficial potential into a weapon of silent death. While Finch and Chambers sought to use the same discovery for preservation and healing," Watson noted. "The same knowledge, yet such different applications. A reminder, my dear Watson, that science itself is neutral. It is the intention behind its application that determines whether it serves humanity or threatens it." Holmes glanced back at the warehouse, now illuminated by police lanterns. "Hawthorne will face justice for his crimes, and his freezing technology will be studied under proper ethical constraints." As they reached the main road and Holmes raised his hand to hail a passing cab, Watson reflected on the extraordinary case they had just concluded. A mystery that had begun with a frozen lodger and expanded to encompass international weapons dealing and the perversion of scientific discovery. "Back to Baker Street, gentlemen," the cabby inquired as they climbed aboard. "Indeed," Holmes replied with satisfaction. "I believe Mrs. Hudson mentioned something about keeping a meal warm for our return." The cab pulled away from Butler's Wharf, leaving behind the warehouse where Hawthorne's ambitions had finally been thawed by the persistent heat of justice. A justice delivered through the combined efforts of a consulting detective and his loyal friend, who had once again protected London from a threat few would ever fully comprehend. In the comfort of the cab, warmed by the knowledge of their success, Holmes and Watson began the journey home through London's winter night. Two figures who had confronted the cold and emerged victorious, ready for whatever new mystery tomorrow might bring. That's our story tonight. Are you drifting off beneath the silver skies of Berlin, the ocean whispers of Tahiti, the candlelit calm of Prague, or the soft night breeze of Buenos Aires? If this tale brought you peace, Like the episode and subscribe for more nights like this. Let the stillness surround you. Let your dreams wander free. Sleep gently now, wherever you are in this wide and wonderful